The woman was lying in her bed. She felt very bad and was seriously ill. She could not understand the girl sitting next to her, who was now squeezing her hand tightly in her palms. The poor child understood that she could not in any way ease the fate of her loved one. And so with tears in her eyes, she looked at her mother lying on the bed and thought that this would be difficult to bear. Realizing that all her efforts were in vain and that she had absolutely nowhere to expect help from, the girl began to cry and thought that, despite everything, her mother remained in a difficult situation and would most likely die. She still could not understand why all this was happening to her, and how it happened that first her father died, and after that her mother became seriously ill. The girl decided that she should not hesitate any longer, and if she had decided to help her mother and save her health and life, then she should act. That is why she took and put something in her bag. After that, she got dressed, threw the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and, already leaving the room, turned her head back again to look at her mother and tell her to wait for her a little. She promised the woman that she would definitely save her. In the ducal palace, the young master was sitting in his office, sorting through some documents at his desk. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and he allowed the person knocking to enter the room. The door opened slightly, and the young man's butler came in, followed by a little girl. He told his master that the Duke had someone to see. The unexpected guest's appearance surprised the owner of the office very much. He asked who he should see and added that they hadn't posted any ads for a maid recently. The owner of this estate was the Duke of the House of Charlotte, Benjamin Charlotte. Since his father had retired, he was the rightful master, and the butler stopped at the door and said that this was not quite so, and perhaps the master should listen to this girl. The little guest took a few steps towards the man sitting at the table and informed him that she was not here to become a maid. She had a completely different goal. She walked up to the table where the young man was still sitting, pulled something out of her bag, put it on the table, and said that he should look at it. The Duke could not believe his eyes. He continued to look at the thing that was now on his table and thought that it was absolutely impossible. The little girl placed something familiar to him on his desk. It was one of the pieces of jewelry that had belonged to their family for a long time. It was a platinum pendant with a thin platinum chain. His little guest told the Duke that he could not help but recognize this thing that now lay before his eyes. At any rate, she hoped that he remembered well to whom it had belonged before. Looking into the face of the Duke sitting at the table, the girl told him that it was a memorable gift from her father, Liam Charlotte. When the young man asked the girl what her mother's name was, she replied that her name was Renata, and she used to work as a maid in the Duke's palace. The young man thought, clasping his hands in front of him. He said that this was what Hal meant, and then added that they said that between his brother and this woman there was love until death. The man turned to his butler and asked him to leave him alone with his guest. After the door closed behind the servant, the Duke decided to ask the girl how her mother was living after the death of his older brother. His little guest replied that her mother's life was hardly easy. She was poor and miserable, and her life was little different from the lives of most women raising children alone. The girl suddenly felt sad and thought that after listening to her story, normal people would treat it with sympathy. But most likely, the people of this estate would probably feel only joy, because they hated her mother because she was a maid. There was no emotion on the young man's face. He was thinking about something after hearing that his brother's beloved was living in poverty and misery. The girl thought that she had come to this estate in vain, but still, she had no other choice. Nevertheless, this was the only place where she could turn for help, to somehow ease her mother's suffering and help her. Their life had never been easy or simple, but things had gotten even worse recently since the girl's mother became seriously ill. The little guest looked into the face of the office owner and said that, most likely, in her opinion, it was all the same to him what happened to her mother. But still, she began to beg him to save her. She tried to look into the young man's eyes to see what decision he would make. But they remained just as cold, and it seemed that she had wasted her time visiting the ducal palace. The man sat silently for a while longer, then stood up abruptly, pushing his chair aside with a creak, and, leaning his hands on the table, questioningly uttered just one word: save. He walked around the table, hung over the little girl with his whole body, and looked at her carefully, asking if she really expected his help. The Duke said that his elder brother had run away with the girl's mother because he was deeply in love with her, and as a result of his decision, their family had lost an heir, and he himself had lost his brother. The girl realized that it had indeed been a bad decision on her part to come here for help when the man told her that the Charlotte family had no reason to help her and her mother. But she still did not lose hope and decided to take advantage of her last chance at the moment when she told the Duke that she was the only child of his older brother. The little guest said that she was ready to agree to any conditions, and if the Duke helped her mother, she would agree to move into this mansion and live there quietly, below the grass. She also promised to stop contacting people she knew before. The young man thought about her words for a while, and then asked the girl again if she even understood what her words meant. The girl nodded silently in response, showing with her whole appearance that this was her final decision after the Duke's words that everything would also apply to her real mother. The girl nodded silently in response, showing with her whole appearance that everything would also apply to her real mother. The young man reminded the girl that her decision could be final and there would be no turning back. He also said that if he accepted her conditions, she would be forced to agree to never see her mother again. The girl again confidently and affirmatively nodded her head at his words and said that she had thought everything through well and was ready for all his conditions. The Duke thought that the girl's situation must be very difficult indeed. Otherwise, he could not understand how a child could agree to a final break with her parent, and so he decided that it would be right to fulfill the girl's wish. When the young man asked her what her name was, the girl replied that her name was Sabin A. In response to a question about her age, the girl told him that she had just recently turned 8 years old. The young man told the girl to follow him and on the way told her that from now on she would be called Sabina, Roald de Charlotte. She must remember this name and never forget what family she belongs to. The girl listened attentively to her companion's words about how her life would change from now on. She was completely in agreement after the Duke promised to save her mother, but in return, she should never forget the weight of her name in the future, as her father did. Another person was closely watching the girl and the owner of the palace. He was much older than the owner of the house and had once been its rightful master. An elderly man asked the butler who entered his room whether he had been mistaken in thinking that the daughter of his eldest son had come to the palace. The servant answered the master that this was indeed the case. He also asked his forgiveness for not being able to bring the girl here, as he was worried about his health. The old man replied that all this was absolutely unimportant. He said that he himself did not want to meet his son's daughter. The man pressed his face against the cold glass of the window and said that he was not interested in the daughter of a puppy who betrayed his parents. He remembered one of his last conversations with his son, when he told him that his father believed that he was always right. But in the young man's opinion, this was absolutely not true, and he would soon be convinced of this. That time, the man called his rebellious son a fool who lost his head over a woman of low birth and disgraced his family name. He promised his son that he would regret his decision. He remembered his son's face well as it looked during that conversation. Each considered himself right and remained with his opinion even after the end of that difficult conversation. That time, he also stood by the window and did not even bother to turn his head towards his son, said that even if he tried very hard, it would still be incredibly difficult, and in the end, his son would bow his head and beg for forgiveness. He hoped that in the end it would happen. Each of the participants in this conversation remained with their opinion and did not change it to this day. The old man hoped that sooner or later it would happen as he said, but the miracle did not happen. For many years, he hoped in vain to see his eldest son at least once more after a long separation, but after his death, this became practically impossible. And now, 13 years later, he stood there looking out the window, thinking that the conversation with his son had happened as if it had happened just moments ago. All these years, he thought that maybe he should have been more gentle and agreed with his child's arguments, but because of his convictions, he never did. Despite the long years of waiting, the old man's heart and soul still longed to meet his son. But something completely different happened, and now his daughter, the person he had been dreaming of seeing for so long, had come to his house. A little girl settled into one of the rooms of the huge ducal palace. During the 3 years that she spent there, many believed that she still remained a complete stranger here. And they thought that at some point she would simply be thrown out of the house and she would be forced to return to her shabby home. One ordinary day, a maid quickly entered the room and asked the maids there if they had finished their work. One of the girls turned towards the newcomers and, calling her by her name, Melissa, asked the girl what she was doing there. The maid immediately began to explain. She looked upset and told her friends that the dining room was so oppressive that she decided to leave. The old Duke was very strict, and this was felt even during the meal. Her interlocutor asked the girl not to pretend that she did not know why their master was behaving this way, because all of this was easily explained. Another of the maids joined their conversation, saying that everything was correct, and she could understand that the Duke could not tolerate the little girl because she was a bastard. The maid who came from the dining room repeated the word bastard in surprise and thought that because of this, the life of the little girl in the house was completely unbearable. One of the girls began to explain that probably everyone already knows that the Charlotte family is a great line of water-type magicians. Thanks to their abilities, all members of the family have enormous strength, and this strength is passed down from generation to generation. Each family member is born with a strong predisposition to the element of water. It is this ability that gives them a huge advantage over other people. The Duke and father of a little girl named Liam were very talented, and so everyone assumed that Sabin also inherited this gift from her father. But unfortunately, she did not inherit the magical power to the little heiress, and although her abilities should have appeared before the age of 10, this did not happen. Rumors quickly spread around that all this happened because the girl had dirty blood in her body, which did not belong to any noble family. The person the maids were discussing at the time was in the dining room, absorbed in her meal and, as always, trying to ignore the old Duke's bad mood. She felt completely alien and unwanted in this palace. No one had shown any interest in the girl in the last 3 years she had spent here, and she was only concerned with herself. At the head of the table sat the old Duke. He turned to the girl and told her that he was setting aside enough money for her clothes. But despite this, for some reason, she always wore the same outfit. The Duke looked angry and angrily asked the girl sitting at the table if she really wanted everyone to make fun of the Princess of House Charlotte because she didn't have any nice clothes. The girl thought that everything was happening exactly the same as many times before. Again, something was not right with him, although before the Duke himself said that he did not like all the outfits she wore. But still, she said that in the future she would be more careful and would definitely wear something else. She looked at the faces of the relatives sitting next to her at the table and thought that all this was not surprising, and it had been like this since the moment she crossed the threshold of this house. She understood that no one would be kind to the half-breed of a dead son. The young Duke informed his father that the prince was due to arrive soon. He would be given a room on the second floor of the main building. Simon said that it was a great honor for their family, because the Empress had entrusted their family with the upbringing of her grandson, and they needed to greet him properly. When the young Duke replied that he understood everything and would prepare accordingly, the old Duke turned to his granddaughter. He informed the girl that due to the prince's visit, they would be forced to temporarily move her bedroom to the annex. And when the prince arrived, she was forbidden to appear in the main building, and also to stay away from prying eyes. Sabina was taken aback by his words when he said that if she were to accidentally meet the prince, she should introduce herself as a simple worker at the estate. At that moment, the girl realized that she really was not needed in this house. They simply decided to send her far away from home on the occasion of the arrival of a distinguished guest. No one even asked her opinion about it. The girl sat at the table with her relatives and watched them. Everything seemed to look exactly the same as it had many times before. But now they seemed completely alien to her because of their decision to remove her extension from the palace. She would have loved to tell them what was going on in her soul right now. Was their decision really meant to say that a half-blood couldn't see a noble prince? And besides, according to them, she couldn't even introduce herself as Charlotte. But it seemed she had no choice at all and had to agree to their proposal, so she said she would do whatever they wanted. She thought everything was fine, and it wasn't the first time she had been treated like that. She had to endure it for her mother. Sabin started eating again. At that time, she was thinking why they despised her so much. But still, she was ready to endure any mockery and humiliation for the sake of her goal. At some point, the girl simply froze and seemed to be dumbfounded. She stopped eating when she heard someone sitting at the table say that it was time to end the conversation about the fifth prince, Ricardo. It was these words that made her freeze for a moment, and after some time, the girl noticed how much her hands began to tremble. And the reason for this was the words she heard. She couldn't believe that she had just heard a name that seemed familiar to her before. Had she really heard anything about the fifth prince, Ricard, before? She knew that maybe it shouldn't have happened, but it was still there, and she needed to think it through. That's why she apologized and said she wasn't feeling well, and asked if she could leave the dining room first. The young Duke said nothing in response. His face showed absolutely no emotion, and so the girl was once again convinced that he was completely indifferent to her. The old Duke said she could go, and the girl got up from the table and headed towards the door, thinking that perhaps the next guest to appear at the estate would completely change her destiny. She felt something like a knot in her stomach, but she wasn't going to stay there, and she thanked the Duke again for his understanding and went to her chambers. She remembered how the old Duke had said that a prince named Ricard O would be a guest at their estate. This name still haunted the girl, and she wondered where she knew it from. When she was already near the door, she suddenly realized that she had heard this name many times before, and it did not mean anything good to her. Sabina suddenly remembered that exactly the same name was in her friend's novel, and it was the name of an unusual person, the psychopathic prince whom she chose as the main character of her book. She remembered how carefree and happy her life had been before, when she could enjoy her very existence and did not pay attention to the problems surrounding her. At one of those moments, someone called her name loudly. In response to the call, the girl quickly turned around and ran towards the callers with a wreath of plucked flowers. At first, she thought that she had simply been reborn, but perhaps this was not the case at all. On the same lawn with her were her father and mother, who called the girl to them. Around them was a picturesque carpet of flowers. She remembered that the prince's name was familiar to her from conversations she had heard while walking around the city. Someone had said that he had a relative in the palace, and she had told him that the fifth prince was very different from ordinary children. Walking down the street with her mother, the girl overheard a conversation from which it followed that the prince did not bat an eyelid when killing animals during a hunt, and allegedly enjoyed looking at blood. When one of the women talking said that this couldn't be, and that he was just a child, her interlocutor replied that everyone was talking as if looking into the prince's eyes and starting to feel differently. All this talk made the girl feel terribly uneasy. She thought it was all amazing because it sounded like a description of a familiar character from a novel. Moreover, it was a description of this particular prince. It was at that moment that the girl decided that this was absolutely unbelievable, and therefore could not be, because she could not have been reborn in the novel that her friend had written and given her to read some time ago. That's what she thought before, until she heard the conversation at the dinner table today. It followed from it that everything described in the book was happening to her in reality. She found herself in a very disadvantageous position. Among these people, she felt abandoned, lonely, and unwanted. She was very burdened by her status as an illegitimate child in a noble family, and now her situation was becoming even more difficult. If before she could at least sometimes feel free, then now everything changed with the appearance of a new inhabitant of the estate. The fifth Prince Ricard was supposed to stay here for some time. It was true, and she had read about all of this in a book once. Her life coincided with the plot of a novel, the main character of which was Ricard Ogail de Cesari, the main character of the novel Chronicles of Cesari O. His life was simple enough, but at the same time, he had many trials. As a boy, he lived a difficult childhood, being rejected by a prince, and after coming of age, he was exiled to fight demons. The long war with demons also left its mark on the character of the main character, but in the end, he met a saint and thanks to this girl, found his salvation. Ultimately, Ricard, having achieved a difficult victory over the great demon, was rewarded by fate and ascended to the imperial throne. After that, his life became even more beautiful. He received the glory that was so important to him, universal blessing, and then he marries a saint, and as a result, the novel has a happy ending. When she read this novel, she immediately told her writer friend that there was nothing special about the main character. He was just a good-natured guy who grew up in harsh conditions, and didn't it all seem too banal? Her interlocutor said that she did not know what to do about it, since the novel was almost finished, and she did not understand how it could be fixed. She may have made a huge mistake back then when she said she thought the main character should be cool. Everything about him is perfect now, but he seems to lack feelings. Plus, he needs a heroine who will fill his heart with love. The girl looked again at the smartphone in her hand and asked the writer who exactly Sabin was, and why she was more important than the main character's beloved. The girl, holding a pen in her hand, replied that she had written in the novel about how, according to the plot, after the death of this particular heroine named Sabin, the main character suffers severe psychological trauma, and his life changes completely. It was this girl who, by her death, caused radical changes in the character and behavior of the prince, and after her death, he becomes a completely different person. It was probably a big mistake to tell the writer why the prince shouldn't kill this heroine himself, because it turns out that the main character is a psychopath who doesn't know emotions. And now she remembered that conversation with her friend, when she advised her to make the prince a psychopath and the killer of the heroine, in whose body she was at that moment. It was precisely this realization that simply enraged the girl. She remembered how her friend grabbed a pen and began to quickly write something down with it. When she asked the girl what she was doing, the girl told her friend that she thought she should be proud of the history she had just created. The girl couldn't believe that the novel had changed just because of a few ill-considered pieces of advice she had given. She was wondering if it was possible to feel sorry for the main character. It was at that moment that her writer friend's pen began to produce sentences about how the novel's main character turns into a psychopath. Sabin nervously shouted, calling for the girls to stop, and nervously jumped out of her bed, drenched in cold sweat from the horror of what was happening at that moment. Now she realized again that she seemed to be having the same dream about how she advised her friend to change the plot of her novel, turning the main character from an ordinary person into an unusual criminal and villain. The girl reached her trembling hand up to the picture painted on the ceiling of her bedroom and thought that this dream had been haunting her ever since she found out that she was going to meet the psychopathic prince. She had trouble sleeping, so she decided to get up and open the window a little so that some fresh air could at least bring her to her senses and calm her down. Sabina grabbed her head and began to think nervously. In her opinion, everything was right. She remembered the name of the main character of the novel. There he was, called Ricard o Gael de Cesario. It was on her advice that the novel was slightly changed. Her friend rewrote it, and as a result, the book became as dark as its character, without compassion or humanity. She couldn't understand how this could happen, but it seemed that as a result of all the actions she and her friend had taken, she had to be reborn, and as a result, be doomed to die at the hands of the protagonist. The girl remembered how happy she was for her friend when the novel became very popular after the edits were made. But to her regret, now a psychopathic prince has appeared in the Empire, and he, according to the novel Chronicles of Cesare O, will definitely want to kill her. She tried in vain to understand why she was reborn in this particular book, and not in several dozen others, the plots of which she also knew very well. After all, there were more positive and life-affirming novels. The girl thought that she was not Sabina from the novel. That is why she is not strong in magic. That is why her life does not work out, and she feels like a complete failure. She again remembered the conversation that had taken place in the dining room, and once again she thought that in any case, the prince was already on his way to this palace, and she was not able to do anything here. She spent long hours searching for a solution and an answer to the question of whether there was a way to influence the plot. Because if nothing could be changed, the consequences would be simply catastrophic. The girl didn't want to die at all. No matter how much she didn't like her current life, she was ready to endure it for her mother's sake. So she kept racking her brains over what she should do. The girl's thoughts and experiences were interrupted by the sudden opening of her bedroom door. Her maid rushed in and loudly called her mistress. Sabin was astonished by the words of the maid, who, while still outside the room, loudly declared that she could not believe that the girl was still not in class, and asked if she knew what time it was. As it turned out, it was not the maid at all. The voice belonged to another person who was not distinguished by kindness and warmth, and now entered the room with a pointer in her hand. The girl realized that she seemed to have missed the start time of today's class, and so her tutor, whose name was Madame Clarissa, literally burst into her room. She still had time to wonder if the afternoon class had really been moved to the morning. She began to remember about it and came to the conclusion that this was the first time she had heard about the transfer of classes, and therefore it was completely unclear why the teacher was so angry. Sabin quickly glanced at the huge clock hanging on the wall of the room and noticed that it was only 7 in the morning, which was too early even for morning classes. She knew that no matter what excuses she came up with, no one would listen to her anyway. Arguing with this cruel person was pointless, and it meant creating even more problems for herself. That was why she had no choice but to simply walk up to the table and sit down in the chair, preparing for the upcoming lesson, which seemed to be at the wrong time, but which, to her regret, could not be avoided. Her teacher silently watched her charge, trying to find any reason to prick her as painfully as possible or to mock this little girl. Madame K. Larisse smiled her sly smile and reminded her pet that she was the one who would teach her everything that Mr. Simon wanted to see in her. After this, the door of the girl's room opened again, and a maid appeared in it, her hands busy with a cart on which was a teapot and cups. Madame Clarissa was in charge of the girl's education at the request of her grandfather. She told her ward that today they would continue to study tea etiquette. The girl sat at the table on which her maid had placed a cup and a teapot with tea. Her grandfather was simply obsessed with her education, and therefore even the teacher's words were law for her here. Sitting at the table, Sabine thought that if she needed to be irritated, it would be enough to simply call Madame Clarissa, and she would do everything necessary for this. Madame Clarissa ensured that in just 3 years of study, the girl made up for everything she had missed before. But in the student's opinion, it was not because of her outstanding teaching abilities. The girl thought this way because her teacher did not at all correspond to the idea she had formed in her head about what a teacher should be like. And now this nasty person sternly told the girl to keep a close eye on the tea. As usual, the teacher's attention was absorbed in waiting for the moment when her student would make a mistake. While pouring tea, the girl thought that this task was rather difficult. The young lady held the teapot with one hand and held its lid with the other. The most important thing was not to make a mistake and not spill the liquid on the dining table. Her strict teacher never took her eyes off her and carefully watched to see if the little rascal would make any mistakes, so that there would be something for which she could be scolded and punished later. The girl looked at the teacher's distorted and angry face and wondered if she had poured enough tea into the cup. The teacher's face did not change at all. Then the woman loudly asked the girl what she was doing and ordered her to pour more. After that, the woman could no longer restrain herself. A loud and menacing roar came from her mouth, calling the girl to pour more. In the end, she achieved that the cup was filled with aromatic tea to the very brim. It seemed that a little more, and it would start to overflow from the inside out. After the girl filled her cup to the brim with tea, the teacher raised her index finger and ordered the student to pick up the tea-filled cup. Sabin began to slowly and carefully lift the cup of tea up. She could not believe that the teacher had told her to fill such a large cup completely. The girl looked at the reflection of her face in the cup of tea and thought that the woman was trying very hard to make her make a mistake. She felt very heavy, and it seemed that she was about to spill it. The girl's arms were as tense as possible. She tried to hold the cup as tightly as possible so as not to spill its contents, but she couldn't stand it when the woman hit her hand with a pointer and shouted at the girl that her finger was raised too high. The maid who was present at the lesson was ready to scream after what she saw. She was shocked by the teacher's actions, and in order to restrain herself, she was forced to cover her mouth with both hands. Of course, after this, the tea from the cup spilled out, and a significant part of it got on the girl's leg, as a result of which her leg began to hurt badly. A faithful maid ran up to her, holding a towel in her hand, and asked her mistress if everything was all right with her. The girl noticed in horror that the owner's dress was soaked in tea, and in addition, the girl did not have a towel on her leg, so the hot water most likely burned her knee. Seeing the result of her actions, the teacher did not seem to be upset at all. She smiled with satisfaction and said that the girl was very clumsy and should have done everything as she had taught her. The little lady did not utter a single word in reply. She slammed the cup down on the saucer on the table with such force that some of its contents spilled out. Madame Clarissa froze for a moment, watching what would happen next. It seemed that the woman noticed the change in her pet's mood and was thinking about what she would do next. It wasn't just the little girl's behavior that changed. The teacher noticed that her little student's face had suddenly changed. Her eyes seemed to grow larger and now seemed to shine through the woman. Madame Clarissa was still standing at the table with a pointer in her hand. She asked the girl what that strange look was. Sabin replied that this was not at all what she should say to her student. Clarissa mentioned the word Lord and asked the girl if she was trying to shift the blame for what happened to someone else. It seemed that the woman was confident in her rightness and did not expect punishment for what she had done. The woman laughed and said that perhaps the incident could have been avoided if Miss Sabina had not been a half-breed. The girl looked at the teacher towering over her with disdain and thought that this woman was very spoiled. She did not even think of apologizing, expressing her disdainful attitude towards the girl. She remembered how cruel Madame Clarissa had been throughout her training. She had constantly bullied and humiliated her charge, not giving her a second to catch her breath. When she was working on the girl's posture, she placed a whole pile of heavy books on her head and loudly threatened her, demanding that she keep her back straight. The girl remembered very well that she had repeatedly kept her in classes as long as possible, declaring that she would not finish until she herself was tired, and very often the classes lasted until dinner. The very essence of this woman seemed to be such that she demanded to mock someone. She did not shy away from any opportunity to humiliate her charge, but still, the girl did not expect that she would ever cross the line. But now, after overhearing the conversation in the dining room, the girl's position had changed. What was the point of enduring humiliation if the prince would eventually kill her and no one would protect her? So she decided that she would no longer tolerate such treatment. Sabin stood up from her chair and looked angrily at the woman standing next to her, who seemed not to feel guilty for what had happened and was ready to continue her torture. The girl took the cup in her hand and held it out in front of the woman, who was stunned by her behavior. She could not understand what her ward was going to do. Eventually, the teacher became interested in what the girl was doing. That was the question she asked her, trying to predict the actions of the young rogue. There was no answer. Or rather, there was one, but it was completely wordless because the girl opened her fingers, and the cup filled with tea fell to the floor and shattered into pieces, splashing hot tea around it. The teacher's face changed color. She looked both stunned and angry at the girl's actions, but she still didn't say a single word. Then the young Duchess looked Madame Clarissa in the face and told her that she was dismissed. The shards of a broken cup lay at her feet, and the liquid it contained was spilled across the floor. The girl seemed unmoved. She did not answer her tutor a word after she stuttered and asked her what was going on. It seemed that the little Duchess was determined in her actions and was preparing to fight back against the harmful woman. The teacher, who had never let go of her pointer during class, began waving it and asked the girl what she was doing. Sabin replied, as if nothing had happened, that you should always answer for your actions, and in her opinion, an employee who caused harm to the employer should be fired immediately. She considered this woman to be such an employee and asked her if she had any problems. Realizing that things were taking a turn for the worse, Madame Clarissa gave the girl a forced smile and declared that it was only an accident. She was simply trying to train Miss Sabina properly. And besides, she had always had only good intentions for her. The woman was simply stunned by the words of her young ward when she told her that now everything should change, and from this moment on, the woman should call her princess. The little girl looked like an enraged beast. She turned to the teacher and told her that now that she had been fired, she was no longer her teacher, and asked again if that was true. A surprised grimace appeared on the woman's face. She suddenly began to tremble with her whole body for no apparent reason and, stuttering, uttered only the word, "What?" Sabin told the woman that she was beneath her rank and did not seem competent enough to teach anyone. The teacher began to object again, not understanding what was happening. She just wanted to find out what the girl wanted to do with her. And the young Duchess turned to her maid and told her to immediately escort this woman to the exit of her room. Struck by the actions of her young mistress, Melissa obediently lowered her head before her and promised to immediately carry out her order. The girl approached the upset woman and told her that she would now take her home and asked her to follow the directions of their young mistress. The next moment, something incredible happened. The woman who had magical skills immediately performed some magical action with her bow and shouted loudly that the maid should not dare to approach her. The girl barely dodged a fast and powerful stream of water that seemed to rush from the palm of the tutor Duchess straight into the face of the poor servant. The girl watched in horror as everything happened before her eyes. She considered it madness on the part of her mentor to use magic on an ordinary person, who, moreover, had not caused her any harm. Madame K. Larisse took her head in her hand and, laughing loudly, said that there was no princess here, and then added that the girl was a copy of her mother. Smiling maliciously, the woman shouted that she could not find anything refined in the girl, and that her ignorant behavior completely lacked any decency. She reminded her ward that she had put a lot of time and effort into testing her, but judging by today's events, it hadn't helped at all. The girl, after hearing this, only looked angrily at the woman. Sabin thought that the mentor was at it again, reminding her of her lowly origins. At every opportunity, this person brought up her mother and the pedigree of the little Duchess. The girl decided to return the favor this time. She laughed loudly and reminded Madame that she really did seem to like her father. The girl was well aware of her teacher's past. Madame Clarissa was originally the little girl's father's fiancée, and all preparations for their future wedding had already taken place. But this woman was left with nothing. The young Duke fell in love with a completely different girl and ran away with his beloved. The planned wedding did not take place, and Madame Clarissa remained dissatisfied with the fact that she could not get into the ducal palace. For a long time, the girl thought that Madame was making fun of her because she was the daughter of her former fiancé and a simple maid, but she still continued to gossip about her mother. The young Duchess's words seemed to have struck the woman to the quick. She shuddered as if struck by a whip and was able to utter only one word. "What?" And then suddenly fell silent. As if pondering something forgotten, the girl said that she had heard that it was supposed to be a marriage of convenience between wizarding families, meaning that Madame might marry Duke Benjamin rather than her father. The girl smiled and said that it would be possible if the woman only wanted a title, but it was also possible that her uncle had also refused to marry her. She asked her former teacher that since this did not happen, perhaps she really did like the girl's father. In the end, it turned out that this woman did not have nerves of steel, and she could also be easily reached. Suddenly, she burst into a loud scream and asked the girl if she could shut her mouth, and what she could possibly know about what happened long ago. All this happened in front of the frightened Melissa. The girl could not stand the nervous tension and, expecting the situation to become even more tense, grabbed the door handle to jump out of the room. The girl silently and steadfastly listened to the woman, who began to threaten her with all sorts of reprisals. and asked her if she knew what would happen if all this reached Mr. Simon. Lady Clarissa's face looked angry and furious. It seemed she was ready to beat her ward and could hardly restrain herself. Then she asked the girl if she had forgotten that the old Duke had hired her personally. And she was here, unlike her mother, who had simply been thrown out. Sabin remembered her grandfather's face, but now she was no longer afraid of him as before. And she thought that indeed he had hired her, but that did not mean anything. She looked at the face of the woman standing in front of her, who thought she had won this verbal altercation, and her hands clenched into fists. After that, the girl thought that this woman had missed one detail, and that is exactly what she told her, reminding her that the Duke would throw her out. Sabin looked into the woman's eyes with her hateful gaze and told her that, unlike her, the girl had the blood of the Charlotte family, and therefore the old Duke would be on her side. The argument between the woman and her young student, which could not be stopped, was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of another person in the room, who, having just entered it, immediately asked them what they were doing now. Madame Clarissa immediately began to scream loudly, addressing the Duke, assuring him that he had misunderstood everything and that she was not to blame for anything. Benjamin, who entered the room, did not listen to her and, turning to the woman, ordered her to immediately leave the room. The woman realized that she could not resist the order of the owner of the house, and therefore decided to remain silent and carry out his instructions. Although it was obvious from the teacher's face that this was very difficult for her. After this, the young Duke told his niece that he needed to talk to Madame Clarissa and asked the girl to sit in the room until she was called. For a moment, it seemed to her that the young Duke was very angry. At least if her feelings were not deceiving her, he looked angry. Therefore, the girl immediately agreed to his request. The Duke went forward, and behind him followed the woman, who did not fail to take the opportunity to turn her head once more towards the girl and look at her angrily, thereby expressing the feelings that were overcoming her from within. Sabin remained standing in place and silently looked at the departing man and woman. She hoped that everything would end well for her, and thus she would get rid of the hated mentor. As soon as the Duke and his companion left the room, an agitated maid ran in and asked her mistress if everything was all right with her. Sabin looked at the girl and decided that it must have been she, frightened by what was happening, who brought the Duke here. Melissa looked very scared, and she wanted to say that she had not run away from the room at all, but had only suffered as a result of a magical attack, which was very painful. The girl thought that, judging by the Duke's appearance and the way he spoke to Madame, he should already have been aware of everything that had happened in this room, and therefore it had not just happened, but rather the maid had informed him, and he had come here immediately. When someone knocked softly on the door of the young Duke's office, he loudly told the knocker that he could come in. His visitor turned out to be a young niece who came up to his table and told her uncle that he had asked her to come here. The young Duke was sitting at his desk at the time, and the man turned to the girl with a request to explain to him what had happened in her room that morning. Sabin wondered why he needed an explanation. She couldn't understand why he had demanded an explanation from her and not someone else. Looking at her uncle's face, which was now emotionless, she suddenly thought that perhaps Madame Clarissa had managed to justify herself while they were alone with the Duke. But then she rejected the thought, deciding that it did not matter what or how the teacher had said. In the end, the girl decided that if anyone should apologize in this situation, it was definitely her. So she boldly asked the Duke what exactly she should explain to him. The Duke of Charlotte seemed implacable. He looked like a real ruler and asked his niece, who had resisted him, why she had arbitrarily dismissed her teacher. Then he added that she had told him that the girl did not want to go to class, and that made her irritable. Sabin looked into the young man's face and asked him if he could really believe it. The man replied that his decision depended entirely on her answer. He also said that it was impossible to understand the situation by listening to only one side. The girl decided that there was some sense in his words. Everything was true, and perhaps the Duke would really take her side. So she decided to be completely honest with him, not deciding whether to begin her story about what had happened. The young Duchess nervously tugged at the hem of her dress with her fingers. At this time, the Duke did not take his eyes off her and watched the girl intently, waiting for her answer. When his gaze dropped just below the girl's face, he suddenly asked her, with irritation and surprise, what it was. The man pointed with his eyes and finger at the girl's leg where the tea had spilled. There was significant damage there from the burn she had received. The little Duchess lifted her dress a little so that the Duke could see her wound fully, and then told him that it had happened during a tea etiquette lesson. The young man was stunned by the story of his niece, who told him that she had in her hands a cup of tea filled to the brim, about the same size as the one now standing next to him. After that, Sabin told him that during the lesson, Madame Clarissa had hit her on the back of her hand, saying that she had raised her finger too high. The girl had gotten scared and spilled her tea, and he would now be able to see the results with his own eyes. The little girl decided to go all the way. She told the Duke that she had heard that Madame Clarissa had once been her father's fiancée, and then asked him if he could be sure that there was no evil intent in her action. The Duke was silent for a moment. He seemed to be considering whether the story his niece had told him was credible, and wondering what course he should take now. The girl stared at his face, trying to guess the young man's decision. She hoped that he would be on her side. Her expectations were justified. The Duke looked into the girl's face and said that he believed that what she had told him was true, and therefore, in his opinion, they should change their teacher. After this, the man added that Dr. Eugenia was currently at a conference with her assistants, but as soon as she returned, he would definitely arrange for her to be sent to his niece. It seemed that their conversation was not over yet. The man looked at the girl standing in front of him and said that he wanted to tell her something very important. The man's face looked very serious at that moment. He told Sabin that next time, if something similar to today's event happened, she should immediately inform him about it. The girl thought that next time it would sound very inappropriate, as if they were supposed to listen to her. She thought that no one trusted her, and the one who was watching her the most was the young Duke. Sabin thought that Madame Clarissa had been brought in as a teacher on purpose. It was very sensible to hire a failed bride as a teacher, and it could only have been done on purpose. She nervously pinched the fold of her dress again and wondered if anyone would have listened to her if she had complained not about Madame Clarissa, but about the old Duke. Perhaps that was not to be expected. After this, the girl thanked the Duke for his concern for her, asked him for forgiveness, and saying goodbye, went to her room. The young man said that they might not see each other for a while, as he would be busy preparing for the prince's arrival and was very afraid that he would not be able to find time in his schedule to find a new teacher. The girl was struck by his words that he would need to sort out all the details for the upcoming dinner with Lady Annabelle. And besides, Fabian should also return soon. It was these last words that struck the girl the most. She had not expected the return of this vile boy who had been trying to make fun of her every now and then. It seemed like he wanted to use any opportunity to humiliate or set her up. Like the time he broke a vase and said wasn't that the vase her father had given her? He then approached the girl who was kneeling and asked her if she should have been more careful, because it was a very valuable thing, and she had broken it. The girl continued to kneel before him, and the evil boy added that it must be very difficult for her to pretend to be a princess. The girl understood that all his actions were intentional, and he deliberately tried to mock her at every opportunity. Charlotte's eldest son was just such a naughty boy, Fabian Charlotte. And it was he, according to his father, who was soon to return to his father's house. This boy was her cousin, and if you don't take into account his vile behavior, you could say that he was a very sweet and nice child, who was absolutely no different from his other peers. Fabian, just like all the other members of the ducal family, was hostile to the girl every time he saw her. It seemed that he enjoyed his mockery of his cousin. This nasty boy often falsely accused his cousin of things she had not done. It seemed as if the boy wanted her to be hated even more, although this was hardly possible. Every time the boy left and went away from home, his sister watched and secretly rejoiced that she would have at least some time to rest from his pranks. Things became calmer when Fabian entered the academy, but when he returned to the estate, the girl tried her best to stay out of his sight. Sabin's thoughts were occupied only with how she would manage to survive the coming time, when her nasty cousin and the prince, from whom nothing good could be expected, would simultaneously settle in the house. The young Duke informed his niece that he planned to stay in the mansion for as long as the prince was visiting. Then he asked the girl to keep a low profile and to greet His Highness with dignity. The girl understood that with the arrival of the prince, her life would change significantly. Her uncle's orders were in her best interests, and so she silently agreed to become completely invisible during her stay in the prince's house. But still, some of the Duke's words surprised the girl. She could not understand what the man meant by the word worthy and how she could greet the high-ranking guest. She looked again at the Duke sitting at the table and thought that, judging by the Duke's words, she was therefore unworthy of saying a word. It didn't even look funny. The Duke said that on this occasion they had decided to have a family dinner, and Lady Annabelle would be invited to it. Sabin replied that she promised to behave quietly so that he would not be ashamed. Since this was a family event, the girl should also attend it. The Duke seemed to think about something for a moment. From his expression, the girl thought that he wanted to tell her something else but could not bring himself to do so. When the young Duke told his niece that it was time for her to go, she made a slight curtsy, bowed to him, and said goodbye. When, closing the door, Sabin took another quick look into her uncle's office, she noticed that the man was still sitting, motionless, in his chair, looking ahead, staring at some unknown point. After some time, the girl stopped in the corridor and began to think. She breathed a sigh of relief and thought that her life in this mansion was becoming simply unbearable. And it seemed that all the circumstances were against her. After analyzing the entire conversation with her uncle, the girl came to the conclusion that, with his words, the man had humiliated her even more and showed her the true position in this family. She was angry and regretted that she could not change anything. It seemed to her that her uncle did not even care about her. Sabin went to the window and looked out into the courtyard of the Duke's palace. She thought that she should forget about everything and stop thinking about it for a while. The most important thing now was not to let the prince get close to her. The girl heard the whispers of the maids standing near her, who were saying that Madame Clarissa had been fired for harming Miss Sabin. Other maids said that even Madame Clarissa's father came to ask for forgiveness, but the Duke was unyielding. The girls had a conversation about how they had pretended not to notice all this bullying of the young lady for a long time. They also hoped that they would not be thrown out like Madame Clarissa if they did not act as she did. The conversation between the maids and servants was interrupted by a woman who suddenly appeared and asked them in a loud voice what they were doing there. The girls suddenly fell silent, not daring to say anything to this woman. It was obvious from the appearance of the maids that they were afraid of this woman who had appeared out of nowhere, whose appearance was so unexpected. Among the other girls, work immediately began to boil, and all conversation ceased as soon as they heard that the head maid, who was their immediate supervisor, had arrived. For a moment, there was a silent scene. The head maid looked at the real girls with interest and expectation, waiting for an explanation, and they could not bring themselves to tell her the real topic of their conversation. But the girls still decided to tell the head maid everything, and hesitantly said that they thought that if they did not improve and change their attitude towards the young lady, then they too would be fired from the estate. The head maid only smiled when she heard the words of one of the girls, who told her that they were afraid that their masters would find out about their disdainful attitude towards the young miss. This didn't seem to frighten their strict boss at all. She smiled again and told the girls that they should have realized this earlier and been more careful. The woman smiled slyly and told the maids that for now they should be more polite, because Sabin was still a mistress, and they should behave appropriately with her. And she added that this would be until the Duke recognized her as part of the Charlotte family. The young lady was in her bedroom at the time. She was sitting on the bed, and her faithful maid was eliminating the consequences of the wound she had received during class. The girl was smearing the burn with some ointment, and although the skin on the young Duchess's leg looked terrible and was very painful at the sight of the burn, the girl was warmed by the thought that she would no longer have to go to Madame K. Larissa's classes and endure this vile woman. At least something made the girl happy that day. She was happy with her small success and thought that there would be no more meetings and lessons. She didn't even expect that everything would end exactly like this. Sabin thought again that a small burn on her leg was worth the dismissal of the hated teacher, and that this could somehow compensate for all the years of bullying. The girl again remembered how much pain and abuse she had to endure during her lessons with this woman. She could not endure lessons with her now, when the manor was also supposed to have a hated cousin and prince who, perhaps, would someday become the cause of her death. Melissa, who was currently tending to her mistress's wound, suddenly froze unexpectedly, and then the girl's entire body shook violently after she heard something. Perhaps the girl did say some of the words out loud, but she was not going to hold back, giving in completely to the emotions that overwhelmed her thoughts. She wondered if her words had seemed like a warning to her. She again remembered her lessons with the hated teacher and thought that even if her maid had mocked her, she had constantly watched everything that was happening from the closest distance. So now the girl understood why the maid had been so scared. The girl remembered how tenderly and affectionately the maid always watched her little mistress. Perhaps she would have liked to help her, but it was still beyond her power. Then Sabin remembered the face of her maid during the events of today. And it was the girl who called the Duke, which seemed even more surprising. But she still did not dare to change her opinion about the maid. All these events did not change anything. The maid's eyes showed fear as she looked at her little mistress's face, distorted with anger. But she, seeing this, asked Melissa not to be nervous. The young Duchess smiled at her maid and said that she was in no danger because she had done nothing wrong and there was no reason to punish her. When Melissa raised her head and looked into the face of her young mistress, she noticed that in the girl's eyes there was a noticeable predisposition towards her, and she was also very kind and truly loved her mistress. After this, Melissa folded her hands in front of her, burst into loud tears, and began to ask forgiveness from her little mistress. The girl decided to speak out and told the girl that she had long since begun to feel sorry for her. She was constantly uneasy, and she tried to tell Vanessa about everything, but this did not bring any results. Vanessa was the name of the head maid. The girl reported that this woman pretended that nothing was happening, and now the young duchess realized that she had another person who would not hurt to be punished in the same way. Melissa knelt before her duchess and asked for her forgiveness. She said she had no idea things would turn out this way. The girl promised that she would never ignore anything that could harm the girl again. Sabin asked her again if the maid really would not ignore something that could harm her, and asked if this meant that from now on she promised to be on her side. It seemed that the maid did not quite understand the little girl's words, so she asked again what she was asking her about. Sitting on her bed, the little girl told the maid that she asked her to follow her will, which would now be above the instructions of the Duke and Monsieur Simon. It seemed that the maid was truly shocked by the words of the mistress. She froze for a moment in bewilderment, comprehending what she had just heard. The girl waited for an answer from the maid, who seemed to be choosing her words in order to refuse her. That was exactly what she thought. But everything turned out completely differently. Melissa told her that she had a younger sister, the same age as the Duchess. She asked not to take it as rudeness, but every time the girl was bullied, it seemed to her that it was happening to her younger sister. Still kneeling before her mistress, the maid promised her that from that moment on she would obey only her. Sabin smiled happily and asked the maid again if she was really ready to do this. After the girl confirmed what she had said again, the girl asked her if she knew which room on the second floor the prince would be staying in. The girl walked along the corridor of the palace and remembered the plot of the novel she had read. In the book, Sabin was a minor character who only appeared in memories. She knew how the heroine of the novel died, but she never found out why she died. She also thought that it would not be so easy to follow the old duke's order to avoid the prince. 6 months was quite a long time. No matter how big the mansion was, it would be difficult to hide from the prince. Her faithful maid told her exactly which room their high-ranking guest would be staying in during his stay in the mansion. The girl approached the door and realized that she had reached the destination of her journey. The girl stood in front of the door of the room in which the prince was to live after his arrival at their estate. She opened the door of the room, which turned out to be unlocked, and tried to do everything as quietly as possible so that no one would notice that she had secretly made her way into this room. The girl had a specific purpose for which she followed this room. She needed to know how far the view from the window of this room extended. Sabin went to the window and looked out into the courtyard, trying to see the farthest corners of the estate that an observer in this room could see. She looked into the courtyard of the estate and thought that she absolutely had to know what the prince would see when he looked out the window in order to hide from him. The girl noticed that the extension where she was to be housed was not visible from the window of the prince's room. Having made sure that the extension was hidden far from the eyes of an observer who might be at this window, the girl was delighted and decided that everything was perhaps even better than she had assumed. At this time, the little duchess's faithful maid was at the door to warn her if anyone else appeared. She did not notice how another maid came up to her from behind and asked her what was the matter. Melissa looked back in confusion when the girl who came in asked her if she had heard any noise coming from this room. When the maid finally persuaded Melissa to open the door of the room, the little duchess was almost safe. She hid under the table in the room, covered her mouth with her hands, and tried not to make a single sound except for her quiet breathing. She heard the maid say that no one was there, and perhaps she imagined it, although she said it was strange because she had definitely heard something. In the end, she decided it was just a draft, and the girl was able to breathe a sigh of relief. She decided to examine this room. The appearance of the maid was quite unexpected, and Sabina decided that it would be the end for her if anyone found out that she was here. When the steps died down, she decided that she would get out of here. The girl thought that, by the way, if the extension was not visible from the room she was in now, it meant that she would be able to avoid being seen by the prince all this time. She considered it an advantage that she was familiar with the plot of the novel. The girl knew the future, unlike the real Sabina. She thought that knowing the plot should therefore help her be more careful. Even the prince's mother, the empress, was afraid of her son and did not understand the motives that guided his actions. No one could understand what motivated this terrible psychopath, who, moreover, was an outsider in this society and sociopathically rejected anyone who tried to get close to him. The girl thought that the main character of the novel would probably have become the same even without killing Sabin. It seemed that he had some kind of mental deviations from the very beginning, and there were no changes in his character after the murder he committed. She decided that she didn't like the idea of being used as a sacrifice at all. Only if the Empress sent him to war would the girl have a small but still a hope of surviving. When the maid's footsteps faded into the distance, the girl climbed out from behind the table and began to look at the room in which the guest from the capital was to settle. It looked magnificent and amazed with its luxury. She walked around the perimeter of the room looking at everything and thought that, even despite the old furniture, everything looked magnificent and luxurious. The girl leaned her hand on the table and thought that this room did not look abandoned. It was clearly constantly watched, and she wondered whose bedroom this could have been before. Suddenly, an unexpected thought struck her mind. She wondered if this room could possibly belong to that very person dear to her. For some reason, it seemed to her that the room could belong to only one person, and she thought it was her dad. Sabin smiled and began to dream. She thought that it couldn't be, but it seemed to be the premises that once belonged to her father. But at the same time, the girl was surprised that her father's room had been preserved to this day, and that no changes had been made to it, and that no one else had been moved in there. She found this rather strange, but still there was no time to waste, and everything had to be properly examined and studied. Looking again at the table near which she had hidden and then stood, the girl noticed that there was some kind of narrow gap between its boards. As a result of these simple actions, a leather notebook emerged from this crack, which had been hidden there for a very long time, judging by the layer of dust with which it was covered. The girl took it in her hands and began to examine it. She was very interested in why this thing was hidden from prying eyes. She was also interested in the identity of the owner of the found notebook. Sabin suddenly heard some noise coming from outside. Someone was loudly walking along the corridor and saying that they needed to move faster, and also pointing to some luggage. She realized that she needed to get away from this place as soon as possible. The girl grabbed the notebook, hid it under her dress near her waist, deciding to keep this thing for herself. Then, looking out of the window, the little Duchess noticed two maids who passed by the room in which she was hiding. And so the girl decided that nothing could prevent her from returning to her bedroom. The path to her room was completely free. This made the girl very happy, as she didn't want to be seen by anyone. On the way, she thought about the reason for the noise that had reached her ears. She did not understand what had caused the commotion because it was still quite a long time before Lady Annabelle arrived. The reason for the confusion that had arisen in their palace soon became clear to the little Duchess. Out of nowhere, a boy a couple of years older than her appeared before her, and not being well with her, told her that they had not seen each other for a long time. Then he added that he was not particularly happy to see them, and the girl immediately recognized who the voice belonged to. It did not make her happy at all, but rather depressed her. Right above her, on the steps, stood her cousin, whose arrival she had recently heard about from her uncle. Trouble came from an unexpected direction, and the girl was forced to resign herself to the appearance of her cousin. The girl stopped hesitantly, not thinking that perhaps it would be worthwhile to go another way. But she had no choice but to greet her brother and hope that after the long journey, he might not be up to his usual actions towards her. It was her cousin Fabian himself, a boy who had been rather spoiled because he had been chosen as the heir to the ducal family, and therefore was allowed to do absolutely anything. The boy took a few steps towards his cousin and said that quite a lot of time had passed since their last meeting, and it seemed that he already missed his sister a little. It seemed that the boy's behavior had changed a little, and now he no longer behaved as before, openly provocatively, and seemed to just want to chat a little with the girl whom he had not seen for a long time. Sabin thought that she had worried in vain. There had been so much noise in the house just because of the appearance of some boy. She had not expected him to arrive so soon. The girl walked towards her bedroom and ignored the boy who followed her. She told him that he had come a long way and was probably tired. In her opinion, he should rest, and it was time for her to do her own thing. Now she realized that he hadn't apologized at all lately. Fabian smiled and asked her what kind of attitude she had towards her brother. He reminded her that the girl lived here to be treated like a princess of the Charlotte family. So why didn't she behave appropriately in front of the next duke? Sabin thought that all his words were just incredible nonsense, and there was no point in listening to the nonsense that flew from the lips of him, her cousin, almost always when he opened his mouth. She looked at the smiling boy standing in front of her and thought that all this was not true, because she had moved to the palace for her mother. But what could some Fabian know about this? Sabin decided not to even listen to the words of the future duke. She thought that it would be good if she still witnessed his becoming a duke, which for her was an event of no importance. The little princess's answer surprised her cousin. The girl said that she was going to get out of here before he became a duke. So why should she have anything to do with him? When the boy asked her again what she meant, the little girl replied that she had to repeat to him for the umpteenth time that she had absolutely no need to please the future duke. Fabian laughed and asked his interlocutor what she was saying. He asked her if she understood what she had just told him. Sabin was very determined. She told the boy that he was free to think what he wanted, and if she was destined to die, why not share her thoughts with her cousin? It seemed that the little girl's speech did not please her cousin at all. It was obvious from his appearance that he was angry and was only looking for an excuse to answer this little rogue more sarcastically. Then he went up to the girl, touched her at the base of her neck with his index finger, and said that she had been given a great favor by being left in this house, and that she was speaking as if she were ungrateful for all the kindness done to her especially. He added that she should be thrown out by the neck to some seedy shelter. Hearing the word shelter, the little person immediately thought about it. She was interested in this word, and immediately an idea was born in her head about whether it was worth taking advantage of it. The boy completely misinterpreted his companion's silence. He thought that she was frightened by his words and laughed loudly, urging her to beg not to send her to the orphanage. At the same time, Sabin thought that it was this stupid and obnoxious boy who, without knowing it, had given her a great idea. She wanted to show him. Could he not convey it to the Duke? And asked him to send the girl to the orphanage. The girl thought that this might be a good way out of the situation. If she went to the countryside, she would have nothing to do with the prince or the house of Charlotte. Then she would be completely free of any obligations, and she would not be in danger of dying. In addition, knowing the plot of the novel, she would definitely try to succeed in this world. She wanted to tell the boy to run to his father and tell him about his idea immediately. The girl made as casual a pose as possible and asked her companion, since they were on the same side now. He got it all wrong again. The boy got ready to fight his cousin, put his fists in front of him, and asked her if she thought he couldn't do it, and shouted loudly that he shouldn't be made fun of. Sabin looked at her cousin's face and thought that he had absolutely no sense, and perhaps sending him had been a mistake. Fabian literally flew into a rage. His face turned red and his eyes sparkled. He said that the girl must be crazy and then began to explain why he thought so. He clenched his hands into fists and held them out in front of him. The girl noticed a slight tremor in his limbs and thought that perhaps she shouldn't have teased him like that. But she still had no intention of giving up on her idea, and once again told her cousin that if he did not have the courage to tell the Duke about the shelter, then it would be better to just get out of her way. When she repeated this again and asked her cousin not to force her to repeat herself, he called her a fool and grabbed the girl tightly by the wrist. The boy's next move was to push the girl with all his might, and as a result of his actions, she found herself on the floor. Now the young Duchess looked at her cousin towering over her and thought that her own recklessness could destroy her. When the girl fell to the floor, the hem of her dress rose up a little, revealing a burn on her knees. The wound looked just as unattractive and immediately caught the eye with its bright scarlet color. When Fabian noticed the burn near the girl's knee, he was immediately dumbfounded and his eyes sparkled with pity. He asked the girl what happened to her knee. Sabin was in no hurry to answer the question. She wondered if she had lost something so important to her as a result of the fall, and began to feel her dress at the back near the waist, trying to find the notebook she had taken from her father's former room. The girl thought that, fortunately, the notebook had not fallen out and was still in the same place. She was happy that she had pressed it tightly, and now she was thinking about how she could quickly get rid of this annoying boy. But he didn't even think of leaving her behind. Fabian came even closer to her, grabbed her by the shoulders with both hands and demanded an answer from her about what happened to her knee. She wished she could just laugh at him. She didn't understand why he was making so much noise about something so trivial that it now seemed too early for her. The boy was shocked by his sister's words that there was nothing to worry about. She told him that during a lesson on tea etiquette, Madame Clarissa had hit her on the hand, causing her to knock over a cup of hot tea onto her lap. When he asked the girl if Madame Clarissa had gone mad, deciding to harm her mistress, Sabine replied that she was not her mistress at all, but a master for Madame, the boy's father. The young man continued to sit next to his sister, holding her by the shoulders. She asked him why he was so angry when she was hurt. She added that it looked as if he was worried. Fabian began to stutter, asking what she meant, and said that he had no reason to worry at all. Then the young man stood up, stood on his feet, and laughed, asking the girl why he should worry about her. He asked her if she was not afraid that she would have to live here in the palace for the rest of her life. He added, asking the girl where she would decide to run if someone decided to harm her, and where she would seek help if she might need it. Hearing the word escape, Sabin immediately understood everything. The boy's actions became clear to her, and before that, she even thought for a second that he was worried about her. Fabian continued to stand next to the girl, who told him that he would definitely say the same thing or something similar to his words today, even if she died. It seemed that the words about death really scared the boy. His face was scary to look at. His eyes sparkled as if they were filled with tears when he repeated the word that the girl could die. He approached his cousin again and asked her what she was talking about. Then he asked her if she had gone crazy. Sabin had already risen to her feet and calmed down a little. She asked her cousin if he could speak a little more quietly. Then the girl looked into the boy's eyes, called him brother, and told him that she had really gone mad and that she thought he should go and rest in his room. Then she added that if he still wanted to send her away, he should talk to the Duke and that she was not at all against the asylum. Fabian was literally speechless when she said these words. Most likely, during the time he was away, his cousin had changed a lot. It seemed that she had become bolder and was no longer going to tolerate all his antics. He still remembered the words she had said about death, which still frightened him, and he hoped that it was just a joke from his cousin. Sabin decided that the conversation could end there, turned around and headed towards her bedroom. On the way, she thought about how different she and her cousin were, and she couldn't believe that they were actually one family. On the way, she met her maid, who had already begun to worry, and asked her mistress if she was okay. The girl replied that she was fine and ordered the maid to bring her some tea. When they were already in the room, Melissa was literally horrified by what happened in her mistress's room. The girl thought that after the loud knocks on the door, it would fall apart, or fall together with the frame. Someone was kicking the door and shouting to the girl whether she was going to come out. The maid began to turn her head, not knowing what to do now. She asked the girl what had happened between her and the young master. Sabine tried not to pay attention to what was happening. She calmly asked the maid how long he would be standing there by the door and then told her to bring tea after Fabian left. She needed to do something completely different. The whole time she was walking to her room and during the conversation with her brother, the girl did not forget about her find, and now she impatiently took it out and intended to familiarize herself with the contents of the notebook. She was still debating whether to read this notebook while her door did not give in to loud blows, and the girl herself did not pay attention to calls to open the door. Fabian was still at his little sister's bedroom door, banging on the door with all his might and shouting loudly, asking the girl if she was going to continue to ignore him and threatening her that she would not get away with it. He was forced to stop and cease after his father appeared in the hallway and called the boy's name. The young man froze at the door, clenching his hands into fists near the door. The young Duke looked sternly at his son and asked him what he was doing there. The boy immediately began to make excuses, telling his father that he was going to go into his office immediately upon arrival. The Duke did not listen to him and interrupted. He said that his son could be heard throughout the entire mansion and repeated his question about what he was doing here. The man then turned around abruptly and walked away from the place as a farewell, telling his son to stop wasting time and follow him. Fabian was forced to submit to his order and, with his head down, followed his father. He said just one word, "Okay," and wondered if his father would punish him for his reckless actions. After Fabian had left, the little mistress's maid was able to leave her room and then returned with a cup of tea and offered it to the Duchess. The little girl was busy at that moment studying the contents of the diary she had found. She thanked the girl and continued to leaf through the pages of the notebook. Melissa noticed the thing that her mistress was holding in her hands and asked her with interest where she found this notebook. The girl approached her mistress and looked over her shoulder at the notebook that her mistress was now holding in her hands. Without thinking twice, Sabin answered the girl that she had accidentally found the notebook and picked it up on the street near their mansion. When she closed the notebook, she said that she was now trying to find the owner because of what was written in it. When the maid asked the girl if she found out who the diary belonged to, she pressed the notebook to her body with a smile on her lips and only smirked back. There was a real commotion in the kitchen. The head cook was beside himself and shouted loudly at everyone. Now he didn't like the fact that his assistants were taking so long to figure something out, and he shouted at them, calling on them to act faster. The other servants were equally alarmed. While the cook was asking if they had finished cutting the ingredients, one of the maids asked just as loudly where she should put the plates she was holding. The butler and the head maid were also busy with some urgent matters. The man had a sheet of paper in his hands, which he was now showing to his assistant. At this time, Sabin was in her bedroom. She was lying in bed and could clearly hear the noise coming from outside. She thought it would never stop, so she covered her head with a pillow. Then she lay back comfortably on the pillow and wondered why it was so noisy, starting from the very morning. She could not understand why the servants were preparing for the upcoming dinner so early. She also could not understand what was so special about Lady Annabelle coming to dinner. She couldn't sleep, and so she began to think. Perhaps it wasn't such a trifle, since everyone was so seriously preparing for this woman's loan. 10 years ago, the Duke's wife, Fabienne's mother, died of the plague. Monsieur Simon was very unhappy that the Duke had remained a widower for so long, and that is why the Charlotte family is preparing to welcome Lady Annabelle as their new mistress. She is due to appear at the Duke's mansion today, and her first visit must be properly prepared. After some time, the little mistress's maid literally ran into her bedroom and said that it was time for the girl to get dressed. Sabine looked terrible. She had not rested and had not slept well. As soon as she lifted her heavy head up, she thought that she had not been able to sleep well after all. She thought that at the moment when Madame Clarissa's lessons were canceled, she had hoped that she would sleep longer. However, all this turned out to be just a delusion, and the servants' worries about preparing for dinner did not allow her to sleep. At that moment, the girl noticed with surprise that the bandage that was on her knee had fallen off again. Sabine stood up to put the bandage back on the burn and was incredibly surprised when she looked at her wound. After this, the girl asked Melissa if Dr. Eugenia had come while she was sleeping, and the maid answered her that the doctor had not yet returned. The girl couldn't understand how it happened. She looked at her wound and asked herself why it looked like that. She decided that what she had seen should be hidden from her maid, and so she covered her legs with the blanket again and told the maid that she would get ready herself and that she could go. The maid also tried to ask why the mistress would suddenly decide to do this, but the girl cut her off and said that she could put on this dress herself, and that she should hurry. Already on the way to the door, the maid asked to call her if she needed anything, but the girl, as soon as she was behind the door, jumped up and began to carefully examine her knee. Sabine couldn't believe her eyes. She noticed with surprise that the burn on her leg had disappeared during the previous night, and now she had no wound. The girl tried in vain to understand what had happened to her. She could not believe that her wound had healed. And besides, how could this have happened if Dr. Eugenia had not yet returned? She began to think and came to the conclusion that there should not be anyone with such healing abilities in the mansion. Then it is unclear how this could have happened to her. Sabine thought that the wound could not have disappeared on its own. Something must have been the reason for such a quick healing. But it remained to find out how and why this happened. All healers can be divided into two categories. There are not many people who are able to heal the suffering and pain of others. The first group includes priests who use divine power to reduce suffering and heal wounds. The other category is magicians, who accordingly possess magical power, which they can use for noble purposes. But since life and death are the domain of the gods, magicians with healing powers are extremely rare, and therefore they are not often found among people. Since ancient times, healing was the prerogative of priests who could use divine power and help a suffering person. Many people turned to priests to be cured, but any help had to be paid for. The fact that the Charlotte family can afford a mage healer as a family doctor only emphasizes the status and wealth of this noble family. The girl thought that recently the only people who came into her room were she and her maid Melissa. Suddenly, the young duchess came to an unexpected conclusion and wondered if this had really happened. She suddenly wanted to test her theory, and for this purpose she took a sharp knife in her hand. The girl then placed the blade of the knife on her other hand and pulled it gently, making a small cut on her index finger. To Sabine's surprise, nothing happened. Not a drop of blood came out of her wound. The edges of the cut immediately closed, and even the scar on her finger instantly disappeared. The shocked girl dropped the knife from her hand, and it fell to the floor next to her with a clang. She saw that her wound had instantly healed without any help. Sabine looked at her palm for a long time and couldn't believe her eyes. Could this really happen? She never thought that this could happen. Has her magical powers finally manifested? Usually, abilities naturally awaken at the age of 10, but sometimes this does not happen, as happened with the little duchess. In such a case, you need to keep a magic stone containing a huge amount of magical power, or get it from an experienced magician to open the way by force. But until this time, all attempts were in vain, and the girl did not show any magical abilities. Her mentor was trying to awaken the dormant power in her, if it really was in the body of this half-breed, according to her mentor. Usually she would try to do this, and then finish by saying that she was done pouring in magical power for the day. After the girl thanked her teacher, she only laughed loudly in response and said that perhaps all this was useless. And in the end, her student would turn out to be a simple girl completely devoid of magical power. In the end, the girl herself believed her mentor's words. She thought it was all useless, and probably her grandfather and uncle were of the same opinion, not hoping that the girl would ever become a magician. Madame Clarissa constantly emphasized the inferiority of the young Duchess. She often told her that what she was born as could neither be concealed nor corrected by any action, and that the blood of a simple servant would always predominate in her. And now Sabin, studying, looked at her palm and the lack of a wound on her index finger. She thought that for a long time she had been receiving magical power uselessly and without result. But for some reason it appeared right now. She would have continued to indulge in her thoughts for a long time if someone had not called out to her, bursting into the young Duchess's bedroom with a call to get ready quickly. It was Melissa, who had been knocking at the door of her young mistress's room for a long time, without result, urging her to get ready immediately, since the Duke had already repeatedly asked her to come down. The girl replied that she would be right there and there was no need to worry. She decided to wait for Dr. Eugenia, since this woman was a healer and could be aware of this situation. And if she could use this power on others, then perhaps she could protect herself. In addition, there was another most cherished dream that the girl really wanted to fulfill. If her magical abilities were really confirmed, then in that case she would definitely try to save her mother. With great hope that she now had magical powers, the girl decided that life was not so bad after all and went downstairs, where the Duke and his entire family were waiting for her. On the way, she thought that it would be really nice to get out of this hellish place, where she felt no support and felt lonely and useless. Another confirmation of her last thoughts was waiting very close by. Her cousin seemed to be just waiting for her to appear, leaning his back against the wall of the corridor. When Sabin caught up with the boy, he said that, thank God, at least this time she had the sense to dress properly. Otherwise, before she looked like a real beggar. The young Duchess decided to simply ignore her annoying cousin and silently walked past him, moving towards her goal and trying not to provoke the young man. Fabian still didn't want to settle down and continued to tease his sister. He told her that there was absolutely no point in ignoring him. And besides, he knew very well what the girl was up to. Looking at his cousin's back, he said that she probably wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, and so she was going to go to some remote place to be treated like a princess. The young man still wouldn't calm down and then said that no matter what she had imagined, everyone here knew who she really was. And then he asked her if she wanted to lead some simpletons somewhere in the wilderness. Sabin replied to her brother that he was free to think whatever he wanted. She didn't care at all what his opinion was. Fabian laughed and thought that he had hit the nail on the head with his last words. Then he told his sister that she shouldn't have any illusions. Did she really think that there were no people there, and that it cost her so much? As soon as she appeared, rumors would start to spread, and she would become an outcast. The cocky boy's speech was interrupted by his father, who appeared in the corridor from somewhere around the corner and asked the children what they were talking about. Fabian decided to joke and said that it was just a normal conversation with his sister, whom he had not seen for a long time, about various completely unimportant topics. Benjamin told his son that he had enough of lying. He needed to stop talking nonsense and he needed to follow him. The man said that Lady Annabelle was due to arrive very soon. Everyone was already prepared for her visit, and even the maids lined up, waiting for the guest who was supposed to appear in the palace. After some time, this woman actually appeared and walked proudly to the entrance of the palace. All the inhabitants of the palace, as well as the servants and maids, came out to greet her. It was Annabelle Rose, a Marie, a beautiful woman who was soon to become the mistress of this house, having married the young Duke. The woman had quite an attractive appearance, and in addition, she was from a noble family. Entering the palace, she said that it was a great honor for her to be invited to the family estate of Charlotte. The young Duke approached his guest and offered her his hand. After this, the man bent down to kiss the hand of his guest and said that she had honored them with her presence and thanked her for her visit. After that, it was the turn of the lady and the old Duke to greet her, who came up and said that they had not seen each other for quite some time. Lady Annabelle asked him if he was all right. Sabin, meanwhile, thought she knew about this woman. She had heard from someone that she had lost her husband a few years ago, but looking at her face, it was impossible to tell that this was a second marriage. The same could not be said about the little Duchess's uncle. When the man and woman walked side by side, one might have thought that they were preparing for their first wedding. The girl thought that in social circles, the lady was known for her exceptional beauty, as were the representatives of the Charlotte family. After Fabian approached the guest, she told him that she was glad to meet him, and as far as she knew, the boy had achieved great success at the academy, and asked if everything was okay with him. The young man replied that he was honored that such a beautiful lady had heard of him. Then he walked up to the lady, took her hand, and kissed it on the back. The woman laughed loudly and said that he was already a real gentleman and would probably soon start looking for a suitable bride for himself. Then Lady Annabelle turned her attention to another person who had also come here to greet her. Sabin stood alone and did not dare to say a single word. She did not know whether she should do it first, and so she froze hesitantly, waiting to see what would happen next. When the girl bowed to the visiting lady, she only said one single word, "Hello," and then turned to her companion with the question that perhaps they should go. The young Duchess had not expected to be treated with such disdain, and, opening her eyes wide in amazement, she heard the lady say that she had been in a great hurry and had not even had lunch. The young Duke and his companion walked side by side, without paying any attention to the girl, who had heard the conversation about how hungry their guest was. Sabina stood there and thought about how unfair life was. Just now, this woman, who was seeing her for the first time, ignored her very existence, as if she was nothing. Just now, she was simply ignored. When the girl's mom and dad ran away, they didn't have any big ceremonies and got married in a small, inconspicuous church. But the family to which her father belonged refused to recognize their son's bride, a simple maid, as his father's wife because of her low origin. Everyone who served in the ducal house knew about this, as well as people who were somehow connected with it, like Madame K. Larissa. All these people looked at the little girl the same way from the moment she first appeared here. No one wanted to recognize her as the true heir of the family, and she had to endure this attitude towards herself. Sitting in the dining room and eating, the girl thought that she was just Liam's illegitimate child, and therefore she should not be surprised at all by Lady Annabelle's reaction, because she was used to being treated like that. And therefore she should only be grateful that at least the food was tasty. Their guest today could not be ignored at dinner. She spoke loudly, intending to be the center of everyone's attention, but the girl did not care. When she looked at the people sitting at the table with her, she thought that there was nothing good in this place except food. She was indifferent to their conversations, which seemed to be about nothing. She was completely uninterested and indifferent to what they were talking about. And moreover, because Mr. Simon was the initiator of the marriage, only the two of them participated in the conversation. Their guest looked happy and excited. She even told about how cruel her previous husband was to her, probably expecting condolences. When the girl looked at her uncle, she thought that, judging by his appearance, the Duke seemed not at all interested in his guest, who could soon become his wife. Sabin looked at the Duke and decided that, nevertheless, he seemed to be forced to marry. The very idea that one could not remain a widower seemed very old-fashioned to her. At some point, the young Duke noticed the girl's eyes fixed on her, and he also looked back at his niece's face. It seemed to her that a silent dialogue had taken place between them. She thought that her uncle was thinking about the same thing as she was at that moment, and that he also found it unpleasant to be here. Benjamin looked at the girl again and then asked her if she was still studying while she had no classes due to the absence of a tutor. Sabin was taken aback by the man's question. She froze, deciding whether she should lie to him and say that she spent all her time studying. After this, the girl told her uncle that, indeed, whenever she had free time, she tried to make up for lost time by reading. At the same time, she wondered why she even brought up the topic at the table. Everyone began to listen to their conversation, and when the Duke asked the girl what she was reading, she replied that she was busy reading the book, The Relationships of Geography and Economics. There was an article there that described the amendments made to the tax legislation, and she was trying to figure it out. Sabin thought that for her age, it was certainly a very difficult book, but she wanted to get to know it, because when she hoped to leave this hellish place, she would have to earn money for herself. Hearing this, Fabian just scratched himself behind the ear and thought that there was nothing special about it, and he would not brag about any book. Lady Annabelle wiped her lips and declared that it seemed as if Sabina was very clever, and asked why no tutor had been hired for her yet. Her future husband said that they hoped to soon find a suitable person who could become a mentor to the little Duchess. When he told her that they had had to fire the teacher a few days ago due to certain circumstances and were now looking for another one, the woman sitting at the table replied that, in her opinion, there was no longer any need for that. Lady Annabelle smiled, looked at the girl, and said that at such a young age it would be nice to go to school and communicate with her peers. The young lord nervously put his glass down on the table after his potential wife said that in their time there were good boarding schools where young ladies were well taught and educated. He seemed upset by the woman's remark and repeated the word boarding houses questioningly. Sabina closely followed the conversation between the man and the woman because it concerned her directly. Then the guest asked the owner of the house about the fact that he had no reason to continue to take care of this child. The girl thought that it wouldn't be so bad. boarding school was a great option for her. Come to think of it, there was another person who wanted to get rid of her. She glanced at Fabian, who at that moment also did not take his eyes off her and seemed to want to speak out on the same topic. She really wished he would. She wanted to ask him if he had anything to say and also support her getting out of this house, but the young man remained silent. He looked at the girl and then speared another piece of food on his fork. Sabin looked at her cousin and suddenly wondered if he was pretending or if he really didn't understand anything. Lady Annabelle decided to continue her thought again and said that she had always known that the Duke was a generous man, but Liam was completely irresponsible in his actions. If someone had been watching the young Duke closely, they would have immediately noticed how his eyes had changed after the guest's last phrase. It seemed that a sparkle had appeared in them, and the Count's face had become clearer and more expressive. The lady still did not calm down and continued, saying that although the Duke's brother claimed that he did not care about the duties of the heir, at such an important moment it was foolish to make such a mistake. Chewing another mouthful of food, the lady said it was all very annoying, and then asked if the Duke thought his brother had made a terrible choice, which had ultimately been his undoing. An oppressive silence reigned at the table. It seemed that the guest had touched the hosts to the quick with her words, and now they could not find the appropriate words to respond. The old Duke coughed nervously, and his son said to Lady Annabelle that she seemed to have felt herself mistress of the house very early, and some of her words seemed rather tactless. The woman immediately began to apologize, gasped, and said that she said all this only because she was very sorry, and she did not mean anything like that. It seemed that the young Duke did not really believe such excuses. He looked nervously and harshly at his guest and thought that, it seemed, all her words were not so accidental. The lady wanted to correct the situation and, justifying herself, said that the Duke's brother was not to blame, since he was most likely only a victim. The girl heard all this perfectly. She was very hurt by these words. Another one of them struck her right in the heart when Lady Annabelle said that the problem was only that her father was too trusting. The young Duke watched his niece closely, and it was clear from his face that he cared about the girl's experiences, and perhaps he wanted to stop all this. The noble lady said that she could not believe how a servant dared to shamelessly seduce her master. After that, she said that it was unknown whether Liam was really the father of this frivolous woman's child. When the Duke turned to his guest again, she smiled excitedly and joyfully, and said that she was ready to listen to him. The next phrase of the host of the house was a complete surprise to everyone. He told the lady who came to them for dinner that he thought the woman had already had her fill, and in his opinion, it was time for her to go home. When the woman asked the Duke what he meant, the man only smiled slightly in response and stated that he was asking her to leave the table. Lady Annabelle's expression changed immediately. She looked disappointed and hurt. It seemed as if tears were about to flow from her eyes. The young Duke turned to one of the maids present, named Josephina, and asked her to order the carriage to be prepared and Lady Annabelle's luggage to be collected. The girl immediately informed him that she would now take care of all the preparations. Lady Annabelle began to protest loudly. She cried out that she had no intention of hurting him, and everything could still be changed if she apologized. But the young Duke would not listen to her, and told his father that since this marriage was not going to take place, he thought it was time to end it. Lady Annabelle could not understand how the marriage could not take place. She asked whether it was really necessary to be so categorical about such a trifle. She addressed this question to Mr. Simon. The old Duke did not answer her, but instead his son addressed her and said that he considered the most important virtue in marriage to be respect for each other. He then asked the silent woman who she thought had decided to leave this orphaned child on their estate. The girl was simply amazed at how everything changed so abruptly during that dinner. The Duke said that he thought they were completely unsuitable for each other in that regard. Sabin tried in vain to understand what was going on. In her opinion, the Duke usually never paid attention to such things, and she thought that she was a stranger to him. The girl looked at her uncle again and thought that perhaps the man did not want strangers to look down on his family, and so he decided to stand up for his niece. Lady Annabelle jumped up from her seat and said loudly that after all this, girl was only the daughter of a common servant, and she said nothing to prove these words. Sabin sat silently and thought that such an excess could not have been expected from the visit for which everyone had been preparing for so long. She thought that it was she who had become the cause of discord between the future spouses. The young Duke stood up after the guest. He said that besides the fact that this child was the daughter of a simple servant, this girl was also the daughter of his brother Liam. Charlotte Dot. For a moment, the young man saw his brother's face as he was talking to his beloved. He looked happy. The Duke said that the maid who had just been insulted by the noble lady was the love of his brother's life. Lady Annabel listened in silence as the Duke told her that compared to her and her love of vulgar gossip, this servant was of a much higher level, regardless of her status. After this, Benjamin looked at his son and niece, turned to them, and said that the meal was over and they should return to their rooms. Then he looked at the girl again and, as if remembering something, began to look at her closely. His niece looked very sad, so the man asked her if the wound on her leg was still bothering her. The girl quietly replied that it didn't hurt anymore and that she was fine. At that moment, she was thinking about what to do and was worried that it was really because of her that everything had fallen apart. She could already imagine how displeased the head of their family would be if the marriage he had planned never happened. She was so scared that she couldn't even look her grandfather in the face. Then the young Duke stood up from his seat, walked around the table, and approached the girl, holding the back of her chair. She looked at his face in surprise. Sabin looked fearfully into her uncle's face, trying to understand what was about to happen. Something happened that no one present at the dinner expected. The young Duke took his niece in his arms and promised to carry her to the bedroom. He said that he would carry her to the room himself so that she would not strain her sore leg. The servants and maids looked at this in surprise, and the girl tried to free herself, saying that she could move herself, and asked the Duke to put her on the floor. Despite all her objections and requests, the man continued on his way and said that in that case she should have left earlier. Sabin told her uncle that she had simply panicked when the lady raised her voice. The girl added that she was perfectly fine and asked him to let her go. She looked at the young man carefully, trying to understand what was driving this man. It was completely unlike him, and for the first time he showed any attitude towards her, as opposed to the complete indifference he had expressed before. She was worried about the failed dinner tonight. The girl thought that her presence at this ceremony was the reason for it, and therefore she blamed herself for everything. She was still in her uncle's arms, and she was haunted by the thought of why he had suddenly started to protect her, when nothing like this had been noticed about him before. The girl felt very awkward about the situation. She thought she was the cause of the quarrel and was afraid that the old Duke would be angry about it. She folded her hands and thought that the Duke had never even stroked her head before, let alone hugged her. She didn't understand why the man was behaving like this. The girl told him that he couldn't do that to Lady Annabel. Considering that he was going to marry her, it seemed wrong to her. Duke Benjamin replied that a few words spoken once should not mean that he was obliged to walk down the aisle with someone. Besides, he never wanted to. The man continued to carry his niece and told her that he had been against this union from the very beginning, but his father insisted on it. Sabin was surprised and decided that maybe it wasn't her fault when the Duke said that after he said that he wanted to make Fabian the next Duke, they didn't agree. And maybe if they got married because of that, there would be a lot of problems in the future. The girl remembered everything that had happened at the table during dinner that night. Now she understood that the Duke had planned to break off the engagement from the very beginning, and that the fact that she had finally gotten upset had nothing to do with her. She knew that from the very beginning it had been just a show to scare off Lady Annabel. The Duke had foreseen everything, and by now his father had probably finished talking to the failed bride. The young Duchess felt better already. She was glad that she had not caused discord and had not spoiled anything. The young man did not find his burden at all heavy. He continued to carry the girl, ignoring her objections and requests to put her down on the floor. When they entered Sabin's bedroom, the young Duke carried his niece to the bed and laid her on the couch. She sat on the edge of her bed and thanked the Duke for his help. The man said that he had always been very curious as to why she always called him only Duke. The girl thought, really, why did she call him only that way? Probably it happened because she felt a cold attitude towards her, and therefore responded with the same severity. But she decided that it was not worth telling the young man about it, and so she said that she called him that because he was a duke. Her uncle smiled slightly and said that things would be a little different from now on. From now on, she should call him uncle, and she should address her grandfather in the same way. The girl tried to protest, saying that it might not be appropriate, but the Duke told her that there should be no buts. Sabin told the young man that even if she called him uncle and his father grandfather, they still would not treat her like a member of the family. She decided to be completely frank now and asked the Duke what was the point of changing their titles if they did not treat her as a niece and granddaughter. But all this happened only in her head. She wanted to ask him a similar question, but once again she endured and remained silent, deciding that it would be better this way. Standing before the little girl, the young Duke told her that she should never again allow anyone to insult her, and that she should always remember that she belonged to the Charlotte family. The girl replied that she would keep this in mind. Duke Benjamin said that the girl should now rest, then turned and walked towards the exit of her bedroom. The girl, who had gone through so many trials and tribulations today, could not calm down and, sitting on her bed, again replayed the events of that day and evening in her memory. She looked out the window and noticed that a full moon had risen in the sky that night, illuminating her room like a natural spotlight. Sabin decided it was time to sleep. She changed her clothes, made her bed, and thought it wouldn't hurt to remember, by the way, how it was all described in her friend's novel. Charlotte family played an important role in the empire, so it was mentioned very often in the novel, especially when Rickard seized power in the kingdom and became emperor. After the usurper became ruler, Duke Benjamin was the first to oppose him, trying to achieve justice. The young Duchess recalled the plot of the novel. Although it did not describe what was happening inside the family, but considering that the Duchess did not appear anywhere, it meant that they never got married. In any case, she felt relieved that it was not the cause of discord. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, and thought that if the Duke got married, she would also have to deal with his wife, who, by the way, was also not such a welcoming woman. With these thoughts, the girl sighed heavily, closed her eyes, and fell asleep in bed, hoping that the following days would be much easier for her. But still, today's dinner was not as bad as she expected. In the following days, the young Duchess was busy with completely different affairs and worries. She had a lot of work to do in connection with the move from the main building of their palace. At that moment, she was busy packing her things into a bag. The maid asked her if it would be better to take a bigger bag. Continuing her work, the girl replied that it was not at all necessary, because when she was at the construction site, she would not need many outfits. She would have to hide from the prince's eyes. Melissa asked her young mistress in surprise if she was taking only clothes with her. As she continued folding one of her favorite dresses, the girl thought that while the prince would be living in the palace, she would not dare to go outside anyway. She looked at the notebook she had found in her father's old room and thought that it was worth taking with her and studying it. A moment later, a voice was heard behind the girl and her maid, and the boy told her that with her actions, she had not only ruined her own father's life, but was now preventing his father from living as well. Fabian stood in the doorway and watched his cousin pack her things. The young man was absolutely sure that it was she who had ruined the upcoming wedding of the young duke. She decided that she should explain everything to him, and so she asked her cousin if he himself could not understand what the arrival of this woman in the family could mean for him. It seems that he was not at all particularly quick-witted, since he immediately asked his sister what she was talking about. He was amazed by the girl's answer, who said that if they got married, then over time they would have a child who would easily become the heir of the Charlotte family. The girl waited for his answer, and he said that she should not think that he did not know. Fabian looked very upset and said loudly that this was why they were talking about it now. Even if he had a brother and sister, by the time he or she learned to walk, he or she would already be an adult. Sabin decided to object to him and stated that the position of a child in a family who has a living mother will still remain higher. She told the young man, who still remained silent, that his father, the Duke, was still young and could retain his title until the child grew up. She turned to her cousin and asked him if he thought that Countess Marie would miss such an opportunity to pass on the title of Duke to her child. Then the girl decided to tell him everything. She told him how the Duke had told her that Lady Annabelle had not agreed to Fabian becoming the successor, and that was why his father had refused the marriage. Most likely, the young man realized that he was wrong in his accusations. He realized that his father did this only for his sake, and therefore thought about how to make amends for this situation. At this time, the girl thought that this conversation, although a little unpleasant, had nevertheless ended successfully. It was quite easy to do. After that, she turned around and told her maid that it was time for them to go to the outbuilding. Both the girl and her maid, who was carrying her mistress's things in a suitcase, went into the extension and began to climb the steps that led to the upper floors. An obnoxious boy followed them and eventually said that they were on the 4th floor and that his legs hurt. He then asked his cousin if she was too high. She didn't say anything back. She couldn't say that she didn't like the move either, and besides, no one was forcing him to follow them. The young Duchess knew that there was already an attic on the 4th floor. The maid approached the door of the room in which she was to live and stopped. Following her was her young mistress, who lagged behind her a little and moved a little more slowly. And the procession was completed by a young man who for some reason decided that he too should come here. When the maid said that they had already arrived and then opened the door of the room, the girl thought that this was not bad at all, because the prince probably would not go up to the top floor of the annex. Inside the room, a complete surprise awaited them. Melissa was so amazed by this room that she even covered her mouth with her hands in amazement. Her little mistress was equally astonished, but she, unlike the girl, had learned to hide her feelings, and so now silently gazed at the spectacle that opened before her eyes. Fabian's face looked amazed when he saw the conditions in which his own sister would live. The young man could only say what all this was. The view of the room that opened up struck their eyes with its neglect. Everything here was gloomy and unkempt, since no one had lived here for a long time. Everyone tried to understand why the room was in such a state. The maid and the two children who came with her stopped right at the door of the room and were now examining it, amazed at the clutter and dirt that reigned in this room. Fabian was the first to break the silence and said that they should wait. He asked if it was his father who had given him this room and added that it looked very much like a warehouse. He put his hand on his cousin's shoulder and asked her to answer at least something to his questions. The girl pushed his hand off her shoulder and said that it was unlikely to be a warehouse, since there was a bed visible in the corner, and most likely that was where she would sleep. Sabin looked around the room and thought she was a real fool to believe in his kindness because of what happened yesterday. The girl thought that they would not have given her such a room without the Duke's permission, which meant that it was he who decided to show her her true place in this way. Her cousin still demanded an answer. Now he turned to the maid and asked her for an explanation as to why the girl had been brought here. He began to shout so loudly, asking what was wrong with this room, that poor Melissa was completely frightened and even lost the power of speech. She did not know what to say in response to the young gentleman. Then, however, she calmed down a little and said that it was Vanessa and told her to bring the girl here, saying that this was exactly the same room. The boy looked really angry. He was talking loudly and waving his arms. When he heard about Vanessa, he ordered the maid to bring her here immediately. The frightened maid immediately agreed with him and said that she would now go for the head maid. After some time, the person who had ordered the girl to be brought here appeared. She asked the young gentleman if he had called her, and then said that she was just about to take the miss to her new room. The young lady looked attentively at the woman who had appeared in the room and thought, "Here is a movie." Was she really going to see me out? The girl thought that the maid should at least have pretended to notice her. The girl's eyes never left the head maid. She understood that she was just playing some role in front of her cousin, and all this was just for show. The little duchess's maid said that she tried to talk to Vanessa, but she passed by the girl as if not noticing her. Sabin remembered that since she had found herself in this mansion, there had not been a single situation that this woman had a hand in that had ended well. You always had to expect some kind of trouble from her. The same thing happened with her unexpected move. She found herself in some cluttered room, and now her cousin was demanding that the head maid take a close look at everything here. After this, Fabian asked the woman who came what she thought about all this, and also said that he was interested in how a person could live in such conditions. Vanessa replied to the little gentleman that she did not understand what he meant. In her opinion, this was the very room that was intended for the young lady to live in. Her words only provoked the young man, and he said loudly that she should not pretend that she did not know what was wrong here, and then asked how she could settle a member of the Charlotte family in such an unsightly place. Sabin hastened to say that everything was fine, but her cousin abruptly interrupted the girl. When he again demanded an answer, the head maid informed him that, however, she had only done what Monsieur Simon had ordered. Sabin was struck by these words. She thought that this was how her grandfather showed his true attitude towards her. The girl's face instantly changed, which did not escape the attention of the head maid who was watching her, and who looked quite satisfied with the effect that her last words had produced. The girl realized that all this was just useless talk. If the old Duke had made a decision, then everything would remain exactly as he had decided. She said that she had had enough and enough talk. Fabian still didn't want to calm down and asked his cousin what enough meant, after which she asked him to stop. Sabin realized that all this was useless, and so she screamed with all her might so that everyone could hear and understand that she was staying here. The young man could not believe his eyes and ears. He ran his eyes around the room again, not believing that his cousin agreed to live in such an unkempt and abandoned place. He then ordered both maids to leave the room and said that he needed to talk to his sister. When the girl and the woman left the room, Melissa dared to ask the head maid if she was sure that Mr. Simon had allocated this particular room for the young lady. Vanessa smiled and replied that it was indeed so. The Duke ordered her to find a place as far away from prying eyes as possible. Then, still smiling broadly, the woman asked the maid if this room really fit that description as best as possible. She thought that this room was the one that suited the status of a simple maid's daughter. The little girl for whom this room was prepared thought exactly the same. She realized that all this time she was just a toy in someone else's hands, and now they decided to send her, as an unnecessary thing, somewhere to a warehouse of unnecessary and used things. Fabian, standing in front of her, scratched the back of his head and asked his sister if she was really going to stay in this room. He said that he was well aware that she didn't like him, but still, despite their previous disagreements, he wished that the girl wouldn't be stubborn now. But the sister's answer puzzled the young man. She suddenly asked him why all this should bother him at all. After that, the girl smiled and said that there was no need to pretend that she didn't belong here, because, frankly speaking, it even looked funny. Fabian looked upset and asked his cousin why she was talking like that to someone who only wanted to help her. Sabina wanted to get this boy out of her room as quickly as possible, and so she asked him as dismissively as possible if he really wanted her to bow to him as a sign of gratitude. The young man got angry and said that there was no point in being sarcastic. After all, he was trying only for her sake, and even his patience had a limit that was about to run out. Sabin asked what patience she was talking about and laughed loudly, saying that this was clearly not about her brother. After that, she told him that he couldn't understand why the head maid treated her like that. The young man listened attentively to his sister, who said that he probably also did not know the reason why she was sent to such a terrible room. Worse than which, it seemed, there was none in the palace. She reminded him that she was an illegitimate child who had no right to show herself in front of the crown prince. That was the whole problem. The girl then said that she was a burden both for the young man and for his father, who constantly ignored her and did not even notice her presence in the palace. The same goes for the grandfather. They all ignore the girl who is not a member of their family, and now they have taken the first convenient excuse to remove her from the main building. The girl decided that now was the time for her to be completely frank, so she shouted out the words that were in her soul, saying that they were all just pretending that she didn't exist. Fabian was shocked by what he had just heard from his cousin. He knew that this was something that had been building up in her soul for many years and was now bursting out. He wished that everything his cousin had said was a lie, but she still wouldn't calm down, and asked him if he didn't understand how hard it was for her to be here, and added that she knew very well why Vanessa and the other maids treated her like that. After this, the girl told her cousin that he was much worse than them. She pointed to the door and asked him to leave the room immediately. She looked angry, screamed loudly, and finally told him that if he understood everything, then he should go back to his academy and not bother her anymore. Fabian no longer looked surprised, but astonished. He couldn't believe that the girl could be so angry. It seemed that he too understood why she felt that way, and he wanted to help her somehow. The boy lowered his head and decided that there was no point in arguing with his cousin. He knew that he had really treated her badly, just as his father and grandfather had probably ignored her. He felt that they were all to blame, and he needed to somehow make up for his own guilt, but he still decided that his word should be the last. So the young man came as close to his sister as possible, looked into her eyes and said that he understood her very well and would try not to bother her in the future. After that, he walked quickly towards the front door and slammed it loudly, opening it. Sabin was left alone in her new room. She felt empty and tired after all these conversations. She was terribly offended that she was placed in such a terrible abandoned place. Turning her head from side to side and upward, she once again became convinced that it was probably hard to find a worse place. The room was in complete disrepair. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. Disappointed, she sat down on the floor and began to think about what to do next. She was not happy with the prospect of living in this abandoned place for a couple more months. Besides, there was no hope that after the prince left, she would be returned from the annex to the main building again. The girl folded her hands in front of her and thought that this room spoke for itself. Having settled her here, they pointed out to her that she was a nobody in this noble family, and this was her place. She decided that this place was what she was. She was a disgrace to the Charlotte family, a despicable half-breed who deserved nothing better, the fruit of a love that had led a member of that family to death. She started crying, and at the same time she was deciding what she should do. In the girl's opinion, this could not continue any longer. She couldn't hold back her tears and cried loudly. She realized that she couldn't stand it any longer unless she changed something in her life and destiny. At first, she only thought about how to avoid meeting the prince, who, according to the plot, was supposed to be the cause of her death. But now her situation has become even worse due to her disgust with the Charlotte family. She was firmly convinced that she no longer wanted and could not stay here in a house where she was treated like an unnecessary thing. Previously, she thought that if she angered Fabian, he would definitely get rid of her as soon as he got the chance. But now she no longer hoped for it. She did not understand why the young man was trying to help her, despite all her attempts to reject this help. She didn't know what she would do if he didn't throw her out. All her hopes were that she would be able to leave this hellish place and find something more peaceful for herself. The girl thought that perhaps she should go to the Duke and ask him to send her to boarding school. But then she thought that this was the reason he had refused Lady Annabelle her marriage. She remembered what he had said to the woman that evening and thought that she would receive exactly the same answer, since the Duke's dignity would not allow him to send his own niece to boarding school. Sabin again went deep into her thoughts and came to the conclusion that in this case there was only one thing left. She had no other options. There is only one person left who could influence her fate, and in the end it is probably worth turning to him. This was the one who spent long days and nights at his window, looking into the distance beyond the boundaries of his estate, expecting that eventually someone he no longer hoped to see would appear there. Sabin decided that now was the time to turn to Mr. Simon. He could probably make a decision that would save her a lot of trouble. Remembering her relationship with her grandfather, the girl suddenly realized that the main problem was that in the 3 years of their acquaintance, they still had not been able to have a normal conversation. She thought that this conversation could take place, but for this it would be necessary to find a good reason to meet with this person. So she decided that she should definitely think about it. And then her gaze fell on her father's diary, and she suddenly thought that perhaps she would find the answer to her question in this notebook. The young Duchess came into the kitchen, which was very crowded with maids at the time. She said that she wanted to occupy the kitchen for a while and that she might need an assistant. It was with these words that she addressed the head maid after the woman asked her if she could find out what brought the young lady here. The woman replied that she understood everything after the girl said that she wanted to cook something and it shouldn't take much time. Vanessa answered her that the kitchen could be entirely at her disposal. But unfortunately, everyone is very busy now, and therefore she is forced to refuse her an assistant. The other maids present in the kitchen remained silent after the head maid asked them if there was anyone willing to help their mistress. The girl looked with disappointment at the maids and at the head maid, who smiled slightly and said that she didn't think there would be any such people here. Looking at her, one might think that the woman even liked the fact that no one agreed to help the girl. After this, she folded her hands in front of her, bowed to her mistress, apologized, and said that it was probably time for her to go. As she was leaving, she was forced to turn her head back when the girl called her name. Sabin smiled as widely as she could and asked Vanessa if she knew why Madame Clarissa had been kicked out of their estate. The woman looked at her mistress with confusion, expecting her to tell her everything herself. She worriedly asked the girl why she suddenly decided to ask her about this. The young Duchess did not stand on ceremony and said that Madame had allowed herself too much, and then added that perhaps the head maid did not know that if a dog bites the hand that feeds it, then that dog will be disposed of. Vanessa, hearing this, smiled and promised that she would definitely remember these words. The young Duchess seemed to be in a good mood, because she smiled again and asked the woman if this was true. After these words, Vanessa's face changed dramatically. It no longer looked smiling, but rather embittered after what the little lady had told her. The other maids looked as if they were worried about something. It was obvious from their faces that they felt uneasy when they told the Duchess that they had to leave her because they still had much to do. Finally, Sabin was left alone in the huge kitchen. She stood in the middle of the room and began to think about where to start. At that moment, someone's quiet footsteps were heard at the door leading to the kitchen, and then the door quietly opened. The girl was very happy when she saw the man who came in. She immediately asked the man who came in whether she had found what she needed. It was her faithful maid, Melissa, who held a bag in front of her and said that she had brought everything that was required, and even, it seemed, a little more than her mistress had asked for. The girl was pleased with how everything happened. She was not upset at all because it was quite expected that Vanessa would not assign anyone to help her. But then she did not really need it. When the maid emptied the contents of the bag onto the kitchen table, she told her mistress that she had not known that Mr. Simon suffered from insomnia. Then she turned to her mistress and added that, frankly speaking, she could not believe it until she herself spoke to the maid who worked in the old Duke's room. When she asked the girl how she knew about this, her mistress replied that someone had simply told her about it. She remembered the diary page that was at the very beginning of the notebook. It said who it belonged to, and the girl easily guessed that its owner was once Liam. Charlotte Dot. The girl happily grabbed the diary and began to read. It was a great joy for her, since it belonged to her dad. Every time she had free time, she immediately sat down to read the diary. She was very interested in his notes, in which he described his entire life. He had started keeping notes when he was a teenager, and the more she read, the more she learned about the kind of person her father was. Her childhood memories of him were vague, but now she could see him in front of her. With joy and enthusiasm, she reread the pages of the diary again and again, trying to learn as much as possible about the person so dear to her. who described all the events of his life in great detail and about whom one could learn so much from his diary. Many of the pages were very difficult to read. This concerned the last days and years of my father's life. There she also read that after the young man's mother, his father's insomnia worsened. She learned that the old man had suffered from headaches for a long time and therefore could not sleep peacefully. This happened precisely after the death of his wife. At that time, he became addicted to alcohol, although he had hardly ever drunk before. It was difficult for him to accept the fact that his beloved wife was no longer there, and he was left alone with 2 children and all the problems. When my mother was still alive, she often brewed chamomile tea with honey, which had healing properties. But now no one makes it anymore. After reading about all this, the girl decided that it was all a rather banal story, the result of which was her grandfather's insomnia. However, she could not have expected that this man, who at first glance had no weaknesses, would suffer from insomnia. It all looked rather strange, but this was her chance. She decided to use it, and for this she came to the kitchen. Her maid asked the girl why she suddenly decided to meet with Mr. Simon. She remained silent, for she could not really tell the maid her motives. She wanted to negotiate a way to leave the estate on terms acceptable to all and find herself in some safe place, like a shelter. Melisse, in surprise, remarked to her mistress that she would never have dared to do anything like that before, and therefore in her eyes it all looked very strange. Sabin decided to somehow explain everything to her and told the maid that now she could not stay away. Otherwise, the end would be too sad. She thought that, frankly speaking, she didn't want to cook anything for her grandfather. But she had no other choice but to somehow start a conversation with him and discuss everything. She had a goal that she absolutely wanted to achieve. She absolutely had to get out of here. The girl was completely occupied with her thoughts, and only the sounds that came from near her brought her out of her reverie. She heard someone quietly sobbing next to her. It was Melissa, who, when asked the reason for the crying, said that her young mistress was trying so hard to be a good granddaughter, and that Mr. Simon was treating her so badly. Sabin was literally dumbfounded by what she heard. She could not believe in any way that the maid would explain her actions in such a way. The girl had no idea that she could have any other goals. Melissa continued to cry and talk about what a good girl her mistress was. If it had been anyone else in her place, she would never have cared so much about her grandfather, who was so unfair to him. She raised one of the nuts above her head and asked the girl if perhaps she shouldn't do anything with them, but just take them to him. Her mistress immediately rebuked the maid. She said that under no circumstances should she act like that, and that she should consider the Duke's age. After this, the maid asked why the Duchess had asked them to prepare them if she was going to make tea. The girl explained to her that walnuts help with insomnia. It was with their help that she planned to heal her grandfather. When the girl asked if she should bring more, the lady replied that this would be enough. The old Duke met her at the door rather unfriendly. He did not even greet his granddaughter, but immediately asked her why she had come. She had not expected such a cold reception. She had thought that he would at least invite her into his office, and now she was a little taken aback and did not know what to answer. After a few moments, she decided that she absolutely had to calm down and not be afraid of this man, on whom her fate in life might ultimately depend. Standing and looking into her grandfather's eyes, the girl mentally ordered herself to calmly answer his questions and convinced herself that this was not at all worse than the death that might be waiting for her somewhere ahead. She still managed to calm her nerves, and the girl decided that she would continue to act according to the plan she had drawn up earlier. Sabin smiled at the old Duke and said that she had come to him for a purpose. She would very much like to talk to him, and so she asked if he could spare her a little time over a cup of tea. The Duke was still hostile to her. He seemed to want to avoid talking to anyone, and so asked him if it would be appropriate at such an hour. It seemed as if some contradictions were battling in the man's soul. His eyes became thoughtful, and he disconnected from the outside world for a few seconds, thinking about what to do. After that, he looked into the eyes of his granddaughter, who looked quite friendly, and then at the maid standing behind her, and decided that perhaps it was worth talking to her after all. The aroma that the man sensed with his nose decided everything. It came from the teapot that was on the tray and with the maid, and it beckoned the man to it. When he told his granddaughter that she could leave, the girl immediately thanked him and took a few steps into the Duke's office. The man walked silently ahead of the girl, completely ignoring her. Apparently, he had decided, as before, to completely ignore her presence. She took this quite calmly, since over many years of living in the palace, she had become accustomed to such an attitude towards herself. And now she was thinking only about why she had come here. The girl smiled with satisfaction at the ease with which she had managed to get into this seemingly unattainable room. She thought that everything was fine, and now all that was left was a small matter. The whole procession moved slowly behind the Duke, who was walking in front. His granddaughter was more than sure that as a result of today's conversation, the Duke would definitely send her to a boarding school, where she would be able to recover and rest a little. The old man sat down at the table, and the maid placed a cup of tea in front of him. Directly opposite him, at the same table, sat his granddaughter, who was preparing to begin the next step of her plan. When Melissa poured tea for both of them in a cup, the girl told her that she could go with something now, and she immediately agreed. The Duke looked expectantly at the girl, as if hinting with his gaze that she could already begin the conversation for which she had now come to his office. But she was in no hurry to do this. First, she needed to appease her grandfather. So she took the teapot in her hands and began pouring the hot drink into the cup. The man took the cup of hot liquid into his hands, and the aroma emanating from the drink reached his nose again with even greater force. His granddaughter watched the man's actions closely and told him to try the drink. Mr. Simon raised the mug to his mouth and took a few small sips of tea. After that, he told the girl that the drink was sweet. He had already started to say something, remembering his grandmother, the girl, but then suddenly stopped. Putting his cup on the table, the man said the word no and then added that the girl had absolutely no need to know about it. After that, his gaze fell on a plate of walnuts, which the maid had also brought here. The man asked what they were, noticing that they were not the same color as regular nuts. The young Duchess smiled and asked the Duke to try the nuts too. The man looked at the nut he was holding in his hand in surprise. It looked completely different from a normal nut. The girl explained to him that these were walnuts roasted in maple syrup. Since the tea was already sweet, she chose these nuts as a dessert. The Duke decided he should try it, chewed one of the nuts, and told the girl that it tasted quite good. Vanessa was pleased with how their meeting was going. She smiled and told her grandfather that she had heard that walnuts were good for insomnia, so he could feel free to eat as much as he wanted. The man's expression suddenly changed. He sharply asked the girl how she knew he had trouble sleeping. She was already prepared for such a question, and therefore quickly answered that he always works a lot for the sake of the family, so she would really like him to rest at least at night. The girl only smiled after the old man's words about whether she really wanted to say that she had prepared all of this herself. The girl's face turned sad when she told her grandfather that she asked Vanessa to help, but she refused, so she had to do everything herself. The old Duke's face immediately changed color. He was terrible in his anger and said loudly that this was an unprecedented impudence on the part of the maid, and how dare she disobey the order of her mistress. The girl thanked him and thought that she should admit that this time her grandfather's arrogant nature played into her hands when he said that he would definitely make sure that Vanessa apologized to her. She remembered how the head maid had ignored her, as always, but still the woman had not taken something into account. And as long as she belonged to the Charlotte family, the old Duke would not turn a blind eye to such neglect from the servants. The girl had no intention of telling the old man that it was Melissa who had actually prepared everything, not she. She had only been standing next to her. Standing next to the maid, the girl directed her actions, telling her what ingredients were needed when it was time to take off the fire and tasting the finished dish. She did not tell her grandfather, who was enjoying his tea, that Vanessa and the other servants had left, and therefore the truth was unknown to them. When the old man had finished his tea, he put the cup on the table and said that now she could get down to what she had come here for. Without wasting a second on empty talk, the Duke asked his granddaughter, who was sitting opposite him, what the real reason for her visit was. Sabin said that she came here for one purpose only. She just wanted to apologize. When asked what she was going to apologize for, the girl replied that she had caused a problem among Annabelle. After these words, the Duke grimaced and said that it was not her fault. After this, the old man fell silent, as if waiting for his little granddaughter to speak. But her thoughts were occupied with the fact that this meant that the Duke had already spoken to his father. The girl smiled and once again realized that she had been happy with the theatrical performance, but she still wanted to say something. She said that she could not say then that she did not consider Lady Annabelle's proposal bad. The man immediately asked her what she meant, and the girl replied that she was talking about boarding school. Her answer seemed to stun the Duke. He fell silent and began to think, not paying attention to the presence of another person in the room. This lasted for quite a long time. After this, Duke Simon looked into the face of his granddaughter and asked her why she wanted to go to boarding school. It was an unexpected question. She hadn't expected the Duke to ask something like that at all, and she was now thinking quickly, trying to find a suitable answer. The girl nervously clutched the hem of her dress in her hand, wondering what to answer to his question. Why? She couldn't answer that she hated him in this estate and had no desire to die at the hands of the prince, and so the girl said that she really wanted to make friends. The Duke answered her that it was impossible. The main reason for his refusal was that the girl was still weak. The man then added that his granddaughter was too young to travel so far. He could not even bear the thought of her being so far from her home. Sabin immediately objected to him, reminding him that Fabian entered the academy at that very age, and no one put any obstacles in his way. She heard from her grandfather a rather banal answer that he was the heir of the Charlotte family, and the prince's favorite. Wherever he went, no one would dare to touch him. The old Duke told the girl that things were different with her. Her background made her easy prey in high society. The girl continued to sit in her chair, and her grandfather became so agitated that at that moment he even got up from his chair and began to walk nervously around the room. He reminded his granddaughter that this was the reason he was so careful to ensure that her manners were impeccable. It was for this reason that he hired tutors to fill in the gaps in her knowledge. He also said that if in the future the girl meets someone who wants to humiliate her, she should be able to stand up for herself. In his opinion, her appearance in society now was premature because she had not yet prepared for it properly. In the old man's opinion, the girl should have become a real lady and be able to ridicule and trample everyone who dared to speak out about her origin. The Duke told the girl that until she was ready, she should not even think about leaving this estate, where she was cared for and where she felt protected. The man concluded his speech by saying that everything he said and all his actions were subordinated only to the good of his granddaughter. The girl mentally repeated the words he had said about her well-being and thought that how people tend to make mistakes, thinking that all their actions are correct. But at the same time, she knew that her future here was far from cloudless. She glanced at the old Duke, who had decided to have tea again, and thought of this man who had never kept silent about her origins and had belittled her more than anyone else, now behaving with her like a real grandfather. She thought about what might happen if she told him about the behavior of Vanessa and the other servants. The girl was sure that they would all certainly suffer a cruel punishment. But at the same time, looking at her grandfather, she was sure that all these actions would not be for the sake of her granddaughter, but for the sake of the Charlotte family. She thought that her own family would not recognize her, and there was nothing more to talk about. Looking again at the old man sitting in front of her, the girl thought that she had had enough. And since nothing had worked out with her idea, there was no point in staying here any longer. After that, she stood up, moved her chair to the side, and said that she would go then. The Duke did not answer her, but only silently watched the girl from behind as she quickly approached the door. When the girl had already touched the door handle with her hand, the old man quietly called out her name. She stopped, turned back, and looked questioningly at her grandfather. Without getting up from his chair, the man asked her if she could continue to serve him such tea. The girl couldn't understand why this had suddenly happened. What had caused the Duke to suddenly decide to talk to her? Could all this have happened because of the memories of his deceased wife? The old Duke was still sitting in his chair, keeping his eyes on his granddaughter, waiting for her to respond to his request. The girl decided that she shouldn't refuse him. Already standing at the door, she smiled and said that her grandfather should come to the outbuilding and she would make tea anytime. She thought it would be great if he came to the room where he had sent her. After that, she smiled her wide smile again and said that the prince was arriving in 2 days, so she would no longer be able to visit the Duke on her own. The girl walked out of her grandfather's office into the corridor and stopped. The mask of cheerfulness instantly fell from her face, and she became puzzled by the problems that had not disappeared from her after today's visit. She thought she had put so much hope into the boarding house idea, and now it had failed. And as a result, she had never managed to get out of this mansion. Suddenly, a completely ridiculous idea came into her head that maybe she should just run away, ignoring her uncle and grandfather. The next day, the head maid came to visit her, bowed to the little lady, and asked her forgiveness for having been too presumptuous. Vanessa stood bent over in front of the young duchess, who at that time was sitting with a book at her desk and paying absolutely no attention to the woman. When she decided that she had tormented this evil person enough, she slammed the book shut and placed her hand on it. After this, Sabin, as casually as possible, asked the woman what she was apologizing for. The woman who was in charge of all the maids and servants in the mansion asked for forgiveness for not providing a servant at the request of the mistress and for behaving so arrogantly towards her. The girl looked at her and couldn't believe that this woman bowed her head to her. She was surprised at what could happen when elders interfered. The maid stood there, still unbent, and was surprised by the words of the girl who asked, "Is that all?" After this, the young duchess propped her head on her hand and told the maid that her misdeeds towards her did not end there, and asked if everything was true. The woman stood there, still unbending, and replied that even 10 mouths would not be enough to beg forgiveness from her mistress. Sabina felt like a real mistress at that moment. She thought that none of this was important and then, waving her hand, said, "Okay," and allowed the maid to go if she had everything. The head maid continued to stand in her room in a half-bent position. The young Duchess became very curious as to why this woman was still here and seemed to have no intention of leaving. Vanessa said that Mr. Simon suggested that her daughter might become a friend of the little Duchess, and she said that with the girl's permission, he would bring her to the estate to help her. Hearing that this was an order from Mr. Simon, the girl immediately thought about it and became a little more cheerful. She remembered how, sitting next to the old Duke during their tea, she had told the man that she wanted to make friends. Now she wondered if he had really focused on that, and she couldn't believe that the Duke had decided to set her up with Vanessa's daughter. Looking at the woman who had caused her so much trouble in the past, she thought that all this meant was that she would end up with a hostage. Still supporting her head with her hand, the girl thought about how all this could be used for her own purposes. But she decided not to show her joyful mood, hid it behind a mask of indifference, and said that perhaps her daughter could become a friend. When she asked the head maid how old her daughter was, the woman immediately frowned. Then she replied that the girl turned 12 this year. When asked what her name was, the woman replied that her daughter's name was Vivian. The young Duchess thought for a moment and began to stare intently into the face of the head maid. She noticed that she looked different from usual, and said to the maid who was bowing before her that it seemed that the old Duke's wishes did not quite coincide with the wishes of his maid. When the girl said that she thought the woman did not want her daughter to become the Duchess's friend, she replied that this was not the case at all. When the girl asked again why and added that it was quite natural, the woman was literally dumbfounded. She was even more surprised when the girl said that, as she knew very well, she was not quite an ordinary lady, and sometimes acted in a way that was not typical of other ladies. Sabin raised her index finger and said that she could, for example, beat up a friend, go somewhere with him, and then return alone, and then many other things that a real lady shouldn't even mention. The head maid was on the verge of tears. She began to beg her mistress not to do anything bad to her daughter and repeated that she had made a terrible mistake. She folded her hands in front of her as if in prayer and promised that she would never do that again. The woman also begged for forgiveness. The young Duchess continued to sit calmly at her table and listen to the head maid, who begged her not to punish her daughter for other people's sins and repeated that her girl had done nothing wrong. She thought that in that case, perhaps she had done something bad if this woman treated her so badly. After all, a person can't just mock another person for no reason. Vanessa remained kneeling, her hands on the floor. She waited for the young lady to answer her. Then the woman again raised her head in supplication and told the girl that if she would forgive her, she promised to always take care of her with all her heart. Sabin thought it all looked just disgusting. The woman who had always looked down on her while she was powerless now looked just pathetic. The woman who had always looked for an opportunity to mock her and then mocked her in a vile way now obediently knelt before her and begged her not to punish her and her daughter. The woman was a little taken aback when her young mistress said that in that case, could she do her a small favor? But then the head maid asked the mistress to say what she wanted. It seemed that Vanessa was ready to do any favor if only her daughter would not suffer as a result of the actions of the little lady. She listened attentively to what she was about to do. The girl smiled and said that the head maid should find out about the prince's schedule and inform her. She explained to the woman that she had been told not to be seen by the prince during his stay in the palace, and therefore it would be unpleasant if they suddenly met. The head maid seemed to hesitate. She thought about it and, stumbling, began to say that she could not dare to do such a thing. Sabin watched her closely. She waited for the woman to understand that she simply had to do this and agree to her proposal. After this, the girl got up from the table and approached the kneeling woman. She reminded her that her grandfather had warned her about the consequences of her actions. The head maid listened to the words of her little mistress, who again told her that if she made trouble again, she would have to tell her grandfather everything. When Vanessa promised the young Duchess that she would do everything as she wanted, the girl smiled and said that it was a very wise decision. While the woman was still sitting on her lap, Vanessa told the woman that the teenagers were still too young to leave their parents. However, she did not know if her opinion would change once the prince arrived. The head maid listened in silence to her mistress, who suddenly felt her own power over this woman, and said that she was sure that the servant understood what she was talking about. The girl smiled with satisfaction when Vanessa said that she understood everything, and said that it was good. And now she would definitely monitor how sincerely the woman would serve her mistress. Melissa, who was warming up with the head maid on the way, was surprised by the appearance of this domineering woman. She looked like a beaten dog and seemed ready to cry after talking to the young mistress. The woman walked past her silently, not even turning her head in her direction, which was completely unlike her. Before, she would have definitely made some kind of remark to her or found some kind of work for her. Melissa went up to her young mistress and said that she was very strange, and asked her when she learned to talk like that. The girl said that even she was afraid to say a word to the head maid, and her mistress scolded her so convincingly and sternly. The girl said that there was hardly anything to be afraid of, and added that she rather despised this woman. The young maid laughed and told her mistress that when she was her age, all she could do was hang out the laundry. Sabin answered her that this was also very good. Looking at the smiling young maid, the girl thought that it was true, and a problem-free child was a blessing for parents. The young duchess stood looking out of the window of her room and thought that there are those who treat children with understanding, realizing that they are still small, and there are also those who neglect them. The thought of the prince's arrival haunted her. She wondered if she would survive his arrival here. Would she have a chance at a happy adult life? She really didn't like the fact that she was in this girl's body. She didn't like being little, but she couldn't do anything about it. As a little girl, she couldn't do many things that adults can do. A look that wouldn't inspire fear in anyone. A body that couldn't function without someone's help. Being a child is good when someone takes care of you, but on the other hand, being a child means being vulnerable both physically and mentally. The girl realized this now in view of the approaching danger. She remembered the night of the anniversary of her father's death, a year after she had lived in the mansion. It was the first year since she had moved into the Duke's mansion and was alone in her bedroom. She felt lonely because of the fear of being left alone. She felt very bad. She remembered her mother, and at that moment, she also felt like a helpless little child that no one cares about. She decided that she needed to talk to someone, but when she approached the dining room, the maid told her that Mr. Simon had ordered that no one should be allowed in there. The girl felt simply awful. She needed to see someone, and with pleading eyes, she began to ask the maid to let her through. When she told the girl that she really needed to see her grandfather, she agreed and asked her to wait there for a minute. The girl hoped that she would still be able to meet a man who knew her father and who could talk to her now. Sabin came to this door with one purpose. The reason for her appearance here was the desire to share with her relative the mourning for her deceased father. She thought that they could become a family, even if only for a little while, and looked at the light that was shining from inside the room where her grandfather was now. She heard him ask the maid what they were talking about, and then reminded her that he had said not to let anyone in, and added that instead of driving the girl away, the maid had even come to pester him. The girl realized from the old man's voice that he was drinking wine at the time, and she heard him shout loudly, asking the maid if she had gone mad. The old duke began to shout loudly. He asked how on such a day this girl still dared to ask to meet him. Sabin heard all this, standing in front of the door of his room. She was amazed that even on such a day, no one wanted to talk to her. After her grandfather's words, she felt even more lonely and unwanted in this huge house. After that, the maid left the room and looked at the girl. She did not know how to explain to her that her grandfather refused to meet with the girl. The girl lowered her eyes and, not knowing what to say to the girl, just stood sadly, hoping that she would understand everything herself. And so it happened. The girl said that she understood everything, turned around and headed towards her bedroom. She walked quickly down the corridor of the palace and thought that this was a completely stupid idea that would have ended this way anyway. She called herself stupid because she should have seen from the very beginning that such people lived here, and she wondered what else could be expected from them. The girl was sure that there was no such thing as family in this house. At that moment, for the first time, she thought that she had come here in vain and began to think about how to leave this ill-fated place. Sabin cried loudly, cursing her hard fate. She felt lonely and helpless. Before, she had hoped to become a part of this house, but now she realized that she was a stranger here and no one needed her. She stopped and continued to sob, and that night she realized that she would have to accept that she was a child in this life. She realized that she would have to accept that, unlike the real Sabin, who really was a child. The young duchess held a piece of paper in her hand, on which something was written in small handwriting. She was glad that this paper had fallen into her hands so easily. The girl was pleased to receive this note. It was the prince's schedule, which the head maid had been forced to bring her. The girl took a pen, deciding to copy the schedule into her notebook. Most of the time, the prince had to be on the training ground and learn fencing. If she was at the annex at that time, they would never run into each other. The girl thought about it when she read that he had to have Sunday prayers, but then she thought that it was not surprising, since he was part of the royal family, and naturally he needed to spend time on the state religion. However, while the prince was in the temple, she would be free to visit the main building. The young lady's thoughts were interrupted by her maid, who knocked on the door to inform her of the arrival of Dr. Eugenia. When the girl ordered the woman to be led into her room, she immediately appeared there, carrying a large suitcase in her hand. This woman looked very cheerful and happy, unlike Madame Clarissa, and as soon as she appeared inside the room, she immediately smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Without stopping, she approached the young lady and said that she had already heard that the girl had received a burn. Sabin replied that nothing special had happened and that she had accidentally spilled hot tea on her foot. Dr. Eugenia looked worried. She said she had learned that the girl had developed blisters and that she must have been in a lot of pain. Then the woman came even closer to her and said that it was necessary to remove the bandage from her leg and see how the wound was doing, and whether its condition had worsened. The doctor's eyes looked very surprised after the bandage covering the burn wound fell off the little duchess's leg. She kept her eyes on it and wondered what it meant. The woman looked at the girl sitting in front of her in surprise and said that there was no burn there, and asked if there was one there at all. When she asked the young duchess if she had lied, the girl replied that she had not. But when she woke up the next day, the wound on her leg was no longer there. Dr. Eugenia looked strange. She thought for a moment and asked the girl if she was playing a joke on her. After this, the woman stood up, grabbed the handle of her suitcase, and said that if her mistress had thought of this to drive Madame Clarissa away, then she had acted wisely, and she was willing to play along with her. It seemed that the doctor was about to leave, because, without letting go of the suitcase, she turned around and began to move towards the door. But she was stopped by the girl's words that the Duke had thrown out Madame Clarissa, that he had seen the burn on her leg with his own eyes. The girl explained that she would never dare to lie to such a nice woman as the doctor, but unfortunately, she herself could not understand how the wound on her leg disappeared. Sabin repeated her words again that in the morning after she woke up, she noticed that there was no longer a burn. And this is absolutely true. Dr. Eugenia looked around in surprise, trying to understand whether she was really being told the truth, and began to wonder what had caused the little lady's amazing healing. She got a little nervous and, to prove the truth of her words, grabbed a knife lying nearby on the nightstand and declared that, if necessary, she was ready to prove all this. The doctor's eyes grew huge, and she watched in surprise as the little girl's actions continued, holding the sharp knife in her hand. Realizing that something unpleasant could happen, the woman screamed and categorically addressed the girl, forbidding her to do anything to herself. But she didn't have time or didn't want to listen to her and quickly slashed her fingers with the knife. The woman immediately jumped up to her, asking what she was doing, and said that she needed to bandage the wound quickly. But when the girl raised her palm up, her words about the incredible and amazing healing were immediately confirmed. There was not a drop of blood on the girl's hand, and the wound immediately healed. Dr. Eugenia's face looked stunned. She looked at the little girl's hand in surprise, not understanding how this could have happened. Her little mistress was interested in something. The girl grabbed the woman by the sleeve and asked her for an explanation. She said that from the very beginning, the woman wanted to hide everything, although she thought it was a lie, and now she wondered why she was willing to do this. The doctor thought for a moment about what had caused her to act, and decided that it was probably out of pity or compassion. She had observed Madame Clarissa's treatment of the girl on numerous occasions. She was often called in after the woman had treated her charge cruelly. Every time she appeared in the classroom at the request of this cruel woman, she noticed that the girl was crying, and the teacher said that she needed the help of a doctor. She had not forgotten how the little girl's legs looked after her teacher had punished her with her pointer. At the same time, the teacher also said that this child was so hard to teach good manners. Dr. Eugenia saw all this with her own eyes and was convinced of what the girl had to go through with Madame Clarissa. And now Sabin asked the doctor that she probably didn't want to stop the girl from getting rid of the bullying that she had to endure for a long time. Still sitting on her bed, the girl took the doctor by the sleeve of her shirt and said that if her guess was correct, could she agree to help the girl in another way. The woman immediately became interested in what was going on and asked how she could help her little patient. The girl said that she had a request for her. She really needed the doctor not to tell anyone about her miraculous healing and that she had abilities. The woman could not understand why this had to be done. She immediately began to question why the girl had decided to keep such a gift a secret, and asked if it would not be better to tell the Duke about it. The doctors were very surprised by the little duchess's words that she was not going to ask to keep her secret forever, but was forced to do so, because as soon as they found out about it, they would immediately try to find a new teacher for her, and there was no guarantee that it would not be someone like Madame Clarissa. Sabin explained to her interlocutor that it was better for her to keep quiet until the girl was old enough to defend herself. It was a pure lie, but she had to use it. If she hadn't lied, things could have turned out differently. If you tell about such a rare ability, then soon everyone will hear about it. And the girl didn't want to risk her life and cross paths with the prince. She also did not want the Duke or her grandfather to know about it. And so the girl was very glad when the doctor promised to keep it all a secret until the miss was ready, after which the girl thanked her for her understanding. When the little lady asked Dr. Eugenia if she could use her power to heal other people, the woman smiled broadly and said that it was, of course, a given. Healing is a very important feature of the mage. It is a selfless power, and at the initial stage, the girl will be able to heal herself. But if she develops these abilities, then in the future, the doctor promised the girl the opportunity to heal other people. But she will have to learn a lot. The little duchess asked the doctor again how the training could take place and what else she needed to learn. The nice woman explained to her that it was a natural gift. It was very close to a miracle, but it was not a panacea for illnesses. At this point, the girl thought that this meant that her gift was now useless, and she wondered how long it would take to learn alone. At that time, she was thinking that there was no way she could unfortunately heal her mother now. And the doctor smiled and said that she just needed to learn how to use her gift, since at the moment she lived in an outbuilding, no one would be able to notice anything. Dr. Eugenia told the girl that she would try to come to her twice a week, and their lesson would last 2 hours, during which she would teach her how to use magical powers. The girl was amazed at how easily this woman agreed to study with her. She didn't even expect that she would be able to get such a good mentor. The girl knew that Dr. Eugenia was a very talented magician healer. She needed to reconsider her schedule because she was also doing other teaching work. The doctor took her notebook and began to review her schedule. She taught at an educational institution, so the girl had no doubt that she was an excellent teacher. However, the young duchess's face became sad. She asked the doctor's forgiveness for the fact that, unfortunately, she now has no way to pay for these lessons, and therefore she will probably have to give them up. Noticing that the girl regretted the inability to develop her abilities, the woman decided to talk to her and said that she had an important message for the girl. Then she sat down next to the girl, looked into her eyes, and said that no sane adult would ask money from a child. And she agreed to teach her not for the money. Sabin looked at the doctor and told her that she had to pay for everything because she would be spending her time on her, which she could have been doing somewhere else. The doctor replied that she believed that parents, not children, should pay for the tuition. She said that she would teach the girl during working hours so she could consider that she had already been paid for her lessons. The girl still couldn't agree with this. She tried to explain to the doctor that she was very grateful for her offer and would like to thank her somehow. The doctor noticed the doubts on her young charge's face and thought that she was a very good girl, and therefore it would only be a joy for her to help this poor child who had suffered so much lately. After this, the woman's gaze fell on a knife lying nearby, and she asked the little lady if she could borrow it. The girl replied that she had no objection, and then asked why the woman needed it. Dr. Eugenia took the knife in her hands and looked thoughtfully at the girl. She decided to check one of her versions now, and that was what she needed the knife for. Sabin looked at her mentor in surprise and shouted loudly what she was doing after the woman cut one of her fingers with a knife. Then she asked the girl to look at it. The doctor extended her hand towards her charge, on which a cut made by a sharp knife was visible. The wound was quite deep and blood was oozing out of it, but the doctor, not paying attention, explained to the girl that if the healer did not feel a threat to his life, then his wounds would not heal on their own. The girl could not understand what was being discussed. And then her mentor said that in her case, everything was completely different, and she was different from other healers. The doctor said that the power inside the girl was so great that she seemed unable to control it, and that was why all minor wounds on her body would instantly heal. Sabin looked at her hands in amazement and was surprised that her power, which had been dormant in her body for so long and remained unknown to her, could be so great. Dr. Eugenia leaned over to the girl and told her that she was sure that someday in the future she would definitely surpass her mentor. Still smiling and looking into the girl's face, the woman said that when this happens, she really hopes for her help. She looked very pleased and thought that it was worth helping this girl. It was an unexpected promise, and the girl did not know whether it was true that she had a special gift or the doctor was just trying to comfort her. But in any case, she could not find out the answer now. But now the girl was thinking about something completely different. It didn't matter to her whether she knew everything about her gift. What was more important was that for the first time in a long time, she was treated with such kindness. Sabin was a little nervous because she had become unaccustomed to being treated like this for a long time. It was a very pleasant feeling that warmed her from the inside. The girl then asked her mentor if she planned to treat her hand. The woman casually raised her hand, which still had a bleeding wound, and gasped. saying that she had completely forgotten about it. After that, she did some manipulations with her hands, as a result of which a fiery yellow ball appeared between her palms. A moment later, her wound was healed, and the woman asked the girl if she was scared when the doctor cut herself with the knife. After that, she smiled slightly and said that the girl had scared her too. So now they were probably even. But Sabin couldn't calm down and asked her mentor that even if it was necessary, she should try not to hurt herself. The woman told her that even if she could heal quickly, it didn't mean that she didn't feel pain. The doctor began to wipe the blood from her palm with a handkerchief and said that, in the end, a healer must first of all heal others and not harm himself under any circumstances. The girl thought about her words about healing others and thought that it was all true, because that was why she wanted to learn to use her gift and magical power. She remembered her seriously ill mother. In the 3 years that she had lived in this mansion, she had never heard any news that her mother had recovered. She knew that the Charlotte family had great wealth and a reputation in high society. The mother's treatment, in any case, should not have taken long if we consider the possibilities that the girl's family had. The girl thought about it and began to wonder what was going on and why she still hadn't been told anything about her mother's health. She remembered her grandfather's face and thought that maybe these people had never intended to help her in the first place. And if that was the case, then she probably couldn't count on their help anymore. The girl was happy that the doctor confirmed her guest today that she had magical powers and the gift of healing. In that case, she would not need help from her family, and she herself would be able to heal her mother. After some time, a magnificent carriage drawn by 4 horses quickly approached the Duke's palace, in which rode a guest whose arrival all the inhabitants of the palace were awaiting. It was a beautiful summer day, and the palace and the garden in front of it looked magnificent in anticipation of the distinguished guest, who was immediately greeted upon arrival at the estate of the Charlotte family. The young man sitting in the carriage looked out the carriage window and said that it seemed like the main building was still far away, and indeed the rumors were not lying. When his companion asked what he meant, he replied that he meant the magnificence and size of the estate in which the prince would have to spend some time. When the young man sitting opposite the prince told him that he should be careful, he immediately asked him what he meant. The young man wondered if he should remember all the events that had happened in the emperor's palace recently. It seemed that his master would not want to hear again about the events that had literally shaken all its inhabitants, but he still decided to at least half hint to remind the prince of what had happened. He said that he asked not to allow a repetition of what had happened so recently in the palace. The prince, sitting opposite him in the carriage, only grinned, deciding that in any case he would do as he wanted, and no one dared tell him what to do. The young man nodded slightly and was again surprised by the prince's cruelty after His Highness's words about whether he was really talking about the fact that he tried to kill the empress. As if nothing had happened, the prince told the stunned youth, who was now staring at him, that the empress was simply unbearable, and he was forced to do so because of her behavior. After this, the prince closed his eyes, took his head in his hand, and asked whether, in his interlocutor's opinion, the son could attack his own mother. His companion knew perfectly well what to answer to this question of His Highness, but he still decided that once again he should remain silent. And besides, his opinion meant absolutely nothing. The young man remembered what had happened that night in the palace. He had heard cries calling for His Majesty. He had also heard the cries of the Empress, who seemed to be very frightened by something. He remembered hearing screams coming from behind the door, and he immediately ran to the door, started knocking on it, and asked Her Majesty if she was okay. He couldn't let the woman get hurt. What the young man saw after the door to the Empress's room opened literally stunned him. He still could not forget the terrible sight that appeared before his eyes. His Highness the Prince came out of the room. His whole appearance was terrible. He was splashed with blood and seemed not at all concerned about the effect he had produced. The young man fell down in surprise and then began to tremble. Stuttering and stammering, he uttered only one word: Prince. He recalled his thoughts at the moment when he saw the prince leaving the Empress's bedroom. If he had seen murderous intent in his eyes, he would have thought he was sick. But the prince's eyes were something completely different. The young man's gaze was completely detached. His gaze was cold and did not reflect anything. It seemed that the young man was completely devoid of any emotions after the crime he had committed. The young man was so deeply absorbed in his memories that he even shuddered sharply after the prince sitting opposite him touched his shoulder with his hand. He remembered that the prince had touched his shoulder in exactly the same way that night when he had attacked his own mother. It seemed that his emotions and feelings had been completely atrophied. He brought his head closer to the boy and whispered in his ear if he could please stop looking at him like that. Then he moved his lips even closer to his ear and quietly whispered that others might find out that he was crazy, and probably no one in the imperial family wanted this to become public knowledge. While the young prince's companion was busy with his memories, the carriage had already traveled quite a long way through the duke's estate and stopped at the main entrance to the main building. A butler came out to meet them, bowing low to the high-ranking guests. The owner of the house himself came out to greet the ruler, who immediately told him that he was welcome to his house, and that all the servants and maids who had now also come out to greet him would be at the prince's service. The young duke introduced himself and gave his name as Benjamin, Charlotte, and said that he is now the head of the Charlotte clan. The prince who had stopped did not say anything in response. He, smiling, heard the words of the host of the house that he had honored them with his visit, even if it was short, and they would try to make this visit unforgettable for him. On the bedside table in the Empress's bedroom stood a box containing her necklace and a gold bracelet. Nothing foreshadowed the events that erupted within her at that moment. The imperial diadem that covered the Empress's head flew to the ground with a ringing sound, hitting the tiles that covered the floor of her bedroom. The ringing of gold resounded high in the vaults of the room. The mistress of the bedroom was kneeling in the middle of the room. Her bedspread was covered in her own blood, and next to her stood the villain who had done all this to her. The woman was in great pain. She screamed loudly, clutching the base of her neck with both hands. She could not believe that her own son could do this to her. The young man she had given birth to was now looking indifferently, without any emotion on his face, at the woman trembling before him, who had asked him who she was to him. He was completely occupied with his own thoughts. Wiping his blood-stained face, the young man did not bother to answer his mother, who asked him what she had done to him. Not far from them lay a bloody dagger. The young man had thrown it away and was now looking at it, not hearing his mother's question about whether he had feelings at all and whether he had ever smiled truly sincerely in his life. The Empress wept bitterly and trembled. She asked her son if he would be sad if someone close to him died, but her son remained silent. The prince was thinking about something of his own, looking at his mother's bloody body. Ricard was not a normal person. He was a real villain and a psychopath. The Empress could not understand how something like this could happen to her son. Continuing to cry, she asked her son if he understood why she was crying now. The prince looked at her, but said nothing. He understood everything better than anyone else, but apparently it was precisely this suffering that brought him a certain pleasure. But he still decided that there was no point in explaining anything to anyone. And so he answered the last question of the woman who was his mother, but for whom he had no feelings, with one word: no. For him, the Empress's question made no sense. The prince stood in his room, which was allocated to him in the ducal palace near the window, and carefully watched what was happening in the courtyard. His attention was distracted by a boy who appeared in the room, who was the owner of the house, and asked him if he was happy with the room. Without taking his eyes off the window or turning towards the young man who had entered, His Highness said that it was impressive, and he was already looking forward to how the days would pass in this mansion. Not noticing any irony in his words, Fabian said that he was glad to hear it, and added that if the prince needed anything, he would be happy to do him any favors. At this time, he was thinking that he had done very well by volunteering to show the prince everything that was in the palace, because he and the prince were the same age, so they should probably get along quickly. So Fabian decided that now was the time to continue what he had started, and told the prince that he was ready to show him the garden now. He immediately stopped short and fell silent when the prince said that they should return to the topic of their previous conversation, and they had not finished talking about Miss Charlotte. The young man remembered that upon his arrival at the palace, he had been present at the conversation between the prince and his father. It was then, as if in passing, that another inhabitant of the palace was mentioned. He could not notice that when he mentioned the girl who lived in this house, the expression in the eyes of their high-ranking guest changed dramatically, and he became interested in the person who lived in the palace. It was he who started this conversation, saying that he had heard that the Duke had a daughter, and shouldn't she also have come out to greet him? Then the old Duke arranged everything. He took a few steps towards the prince and informed him that his granddaughter was not feeling well, and therefore she had to go to the province for treatment. The old man told the prince that they were very sorry, but unfortunately the young duchess would not be able to greet him due to her absence from the palace. Ricard just grinned when he heard this and said, "So it's just a treatment." Now the young man remembered this conversation upon arriving at the palace and asked the young master of the house that the girl must have become very ill, since she was so young and already forced to travel so far to improve her health. Fabian couldn't help himself and said that she wasn't really that sick. The young man's face looked confused because he was saying the opposite of what his grandfather had said. The prince turned his head towards his interlocutor and asked him why, in that case, the girl was sent there. His interlocutor scratched his head, not knowing what to answer. He realized that he had said too much, and now he didn't know how to get out of it. The prince folded his hands in front of him and listened to his interlocutor, who told him that, as the prince probably knew, the mother of this child was not of noble birth. Her origin was shameful for the family, and therefore she was not allowed to meet with His Highness. Hearing this, the prince smiled slyly and said, "I see," and then fell silent, as if thinking about something. Finally, an idea came into his head, and the young man, smiling, declared that he was not one of those people who judged people by their origin. Fabian was simply stunned by his words. He could not believe it and thought, "Is this really true?" And there is the prince's entire reaction to his words. He remembered what had happened the last time he had spoken to the girl. She had been very angry then because she was not allowed to show herself to the prince. That was when she had sent him out of her room. Fabian thought that maybe it would be possible to change this somehow. Given the whole atmosphere, it seemed to him that it could be a great idea. He looked at the prince's face and thought that perhaps his father and grandfather were wrong and the prince might treat his cousin well. Even though his father had forbidden him to go near the annex, perhaps he could do it once. So Fabian smiled and told the prince that if he didn't mind, he would like to see the extension. At the same time, the young man thought that Sabin would simply kiss him for this. His cousin was sitting at that time reading a book when she was informed that Mr. Fabian was asking her to come out to him. The girl replied that they should tell him to go away. Sabin thought she didn't want to meet her brother. Did he really think she would come running to him, wagging her tail? Then she looked up from her reading, raised her head, and told the maid that if it was so important, then let the young man come to her himself. After the maid promised to convey her words to her brother and left the room, the girl remembered that the prince was staying today, and she should not leave the annex under any circumstances. She thought that if Fabian had come to her, then most likely the prince had not yet arrived, and that was why he had decided to go to her. A few seconds later, the door to the room suddenly swung open, and the girl's cousin burst in just as suddenly with a loud bang, closing the door behind him. The young man's face looked unusual. He was nervous and immediately shouted loudly to the girl that he had asked her to go outside. Then he suddenly fell silent, waiting for an answer from his cousin, who, however, looked quite calm and did not pay any attention to his loud exclamations. Continuing to sit at her table, the girl told her guest that she thought they had finished their conversation last time and that she had nothing more to talk about with him. Fabian took a few steps towards the table where his sister was sitting and reminded her that last time she had just yelled at him, and did that even look like a conversation? Sabin raised her eyes to look at her brother's face and asked if it wasn't he who had said last time that he understood her. Her cousin immediately began scratching his head, as he did in any such situation, and then said that, to be honest, he did not expect the girl to take his words so seriously. Sabin told him that it was true, because he had no idea what it was like to be left completely alone, and that was why she didn't want to talk to a man who didn't understand her at all. And that was why he could bully his helpless sister without any remorse. Seeing that his invitation had no weight in his sister's eyes, the young man leaned his hands on the table and tried to calm the girl down, saying that he wanted to please her, and in the end she would be grateful to him for it. His cousin continued to object categorically, so the young man got angry, jumped up to her, and shouted loudly that they did not have time to argue now. He said that the girl should just come down and talk to him. Sabin continued to insist on her own. She asked her brother if he should learn to listen to what others say to him, and repeated again that she had said in plain language that she was not going anywhere. Fabian kept saying that the girl should go. He asked her to believe that she would be very happy when she found out why he had called her into the yard. In response to his words, the cousin grabbed her book again with the intention of continuing to read and said that it would change something. Fabian loudly told his cousin that he was only trying to fulfill her wish, and if she had not been so stubborn, she would have thanked him for his concern long ago. Then the young man suddenly turned his head to the other side and said loudly that perhaps there was some other approach. The girl was lost in her thoughts, thinking that she didn't care what Fabian would come up with. She didn't pay attention to his words when he said that he thought he had an idea. In the next moments, she noticed with horror that her cousin had decided not to stop, but to resort to what seemed to be a last resort, and, in her opinion, had done something unacceptable. The young man held up his father's diary, which he had found in her room, and began to tease her, saying that he would not give it to her until she listened to him. Fabian had her father's diary and some pencils in her hands, which he had also grabbed from the table. The girl demanded that he give it all back to her immediately, but it seemed the boy was relentless. Sabin thought with disappointment that she had made a mistake by leaving her father's diary on the table, and now she bitterly regretted that she had not hidden it somewhere secluded. Almost crying from hurt, the girl told her brother to immediately put the diary on the table. She was ready to tear it into pieces if he did not agree to give her the notebook. In response to her words, the young man only raised the diary even higher above his head and asked her what she was ready to do if he did not fulfill her request. The girl asked him to give it back and said that it was a very dear thing to her. The boy got really excited. He didn't even listen to his cousin, and then said that if she wanted to return the thing so much, she should catch up with him first. The little duchess called out her cousin's name as he turned and ran out of her room towards the door. She realized that she absolutely had to get this diary back, and so, with surprising speed, she immediately rushed to chase after her brother. The diary was the only thing her father had left behind. A moment later, she ran out of her outbuilding onto the street, chasing the fugitive with the treasured notebook in her hand. She didn't even think about the consequences this might have for her. She noticed that Fabian was running away from her and was now hiding between the bushes growing in the rose garden. Without thinking much, the girl decided that she shouldn't stop and continued chasing the fugitive with the treasured notebook in her hand. She simply had to take the thing that belonged to her. Suddenly, she seemed to notice the boy in front of her and was about to shout his name again, but suddenly fell silent. The girl stopped when she saw a stranger standing in front of her. She didn't know who he was, but some feeling told her that it could be very important. She didn't know yet that it was His Highness the Prince who had just arrived at their palace today. The young man looked at her, not taking his eyes off the girl, and wondered what kind of stranger he had met in the garden. Looking at this stranger, the girl thought for the first time that perhaps the greatest obstacle in her life might not be the prince at all, about whose terrible character she had read so much in the novel. The girl realized that Fabian, who was the reason she was in this place where she was strictly forbidden to go, was a much greater danger to her. She began to suspect that perhaps this stranger was the ill-fated prince. The young man standing opposite the girl remembered his conversation with the boy, who told him that perhaps he already knew that the mother of this child was not of noble birth, and her origin was shameful for the family, which is why she was not allowed to meet with His Highness. He was a great liar himself, and so it didn't escape his attention how the boy scratched his head when he spoke about his sister, and he realized that Fabian knew nothing. It seems that this boy was not told anything about the prince who was exiled for trying to kill his own mother. They could not think of anything better to do than send him to the ducal palace. The prince suddenly realized that no one would hide this girl just to please him. There had to be another reason, and it seemed he was beginning to guess it. He remembered standing at the window and looking out into the yard. At that moment, he thought that he could see almost nothing from here, and perhaps this room had been chosen for him for a specific purpose. There seemed to be another reason why he was not being kept fully informed. At that moment, the prince thought that it seemed that the duke's family was deliberately trying to hide this girl from his sight. The young man decided that in this case, the family had staged this whole spectacle for only one single purpose: to protect this girl from the mad prince. Now he realized that all their efforts were in vain. She still ended up right in front of the prince on the very first day, who was now looking at this dumbfounded girl with a searching gaze. It was amazing. He had achieved his goal quite quickly and was now simply enjoying the ease with which he had managed to fool this girl's cousin. After this, the prince turned to the young duchess and asked her if no one had warned her that an important guest was coming to the palace today, and then added that at least then she would have known who exactly was going to visit them. The prince watched carefully the effect his words had on the girl standing opposite him. He wondered if she knew anything about him and what he had done a few days earlier. He thought of Fabian and thought that despite being raised as an heir, he had not become any smarter. He remembered how he had smugly asked him if he could show the prince everything. Rickard looked again at the girl standing before him. She looked stunned, and he suddenly thought that she couldn't even hide how scared she was about meeting him. He wanted to take her to the Duke and enjoy his reaction, but perhaps the situation was not bad as it was. The prince looked at the girl again and thought that everything was not going so badly, and in this palace he could also have some good fun. He decided to scare the girl a little more and then send her back. He continued to look at this girl who had appeared out of nowhere, and thought that perhaps he should question her properly, since she was not saying a word to him. But then something rather interesting and unexpected happened. The girl fell to her knees in front of him, bowed, and said that she greeted His Highness. The young man was surprised by her words that she asked him to forgive her rudeness, because she did not expect to see the prince near the annex. Then she said that she hoped that the prince would show leniency and forgive her. Rickard ordered her to state her name and affiliation. Sabin, without getting up from the ground, decided to be cunning and called herself Vivian, a friend of Miss Charlotte. Crouching near the ground, she thought that perhaps this trick would help her. The girl called herself by the name of the head maid's daughter and thought that in this way she would fulfill her grandfather's request. She remembered this name well during her meeting with the head maid, when she informed her that her grandfather wanted to make her a friend of the young duchess, and perhaps this name would now be of great help to her. She looked at the toes of the prince's shoes and hoped that this way the prince would not be able to recognize who she was. The young man ordered her to stand up and raise her head. The girl immediately stood up and straightened up. She didn't even dare to look in the direction of the prince, who was still examining her intently. It seems that he did not believe her, or suddenly decided to check her words, because he asked if she really was the young lady's friend. The girl bowed to him and again confirmed her words. He said that everything was correct. The prince smiled, scratched his beard, and said that, by the way, he had heard that the duke had adopted his late brother's daughter several years ago. Sabin replied that if the prince's visit had taken place a little earlier, he would have been able to meet her personally. The girl then added that the miss would be sorry that she had not seen His Highness, and then asked the prince's permission to leave. She was taken aback by his question about the young duchess's having been told to go away to improve her health. So he asked the girl why she had stayed there. Folding her trembling hands in front of her, the girl replied that her mother was the head maid in this house and could not leave the estate. She then said that since Miss was in very bad condition, she was told to stay. Looking at this young man who continued to frighten her with his bad reputation, the girl decided that at that moment he was testing her, and she thought with fear that he could really see through her lie. She was very afraid that perhaps, because of her cousin's stupidity, she had fallen into a trap on the very first day and would now certainly become a victim of the prince, who, of course, would not stand on ceremony with her. But Rickard instantly dispelled all her doubts when he said, okay, and then added that if not the young duchess, then this girl would have to help him instead of her. Sabin looked at the prince in shock and asked him what it meant. The prince explained to her that while he would be in the palace, the girl would have to accompany him and fulfill all his wishes. Looking at this man, who, according to what she knew from the novel, was a real psychopath, the girl thought that this was truly absurd. She couldn't believe that she would have to be around the prince all the time. It was just awful, and she couldn't stand it. She tried again to remember what she knew from the novel. Perhaps there was some hint there about how she could avoid a relationship with this man and get rid of his obsessive interest. She suddenly wondered if in the novel, Sabin really did meet the prince in this way. In the original novel, Mr. Simon also forced Sabin to hide the fact that she was part of the family. If you think about it, the prince would not be able to kill a member of a high-ranking family so easily. The girl was suddenly struck by the thought that it was a mistake. And it happened because the girl hid her identity from the prince. Looking at the smiling prince, she decided that no one would stand up for the daughter of an ordinary servant, and even if she confessed now, she would still be executed for lying to the royal family. Meanwhile, the prince asked the girl not to worry, adding that she would not work for free, and he would agree on everything with her master. She immediately began to beg the prince not to tell her master anything. She said that she would do everything for free, and there was no need for this conversation. She thought that Mr. Simon had tried his best to hide her, and now he would definitely be angry if he found out that she had met with the prince. But this also did not satisfy the girl, because then the Duke would find out about Dr. Eugenia's lessons. In the worst case, he could assign guards. The girl put her hand to her chest and told the prince how she could ask to be paid when she had the honor of serving the prince himself. Bowing her head, she said that while her mistress was away, she had nothing to do, and if the prince needed anything, she would always be at his service. Rickard answered her that all this was very commendable, and it seemed that her mistress had taught her friend good manners. At this time, Sabin was thinking that under no circumstances should the prince suspect anything, because if he noticed something strange, then she would definitely have to run. His Highness told the girl that he would not detain her and that she should come here by the time his training was over. He also told the girl standing in front of him that she should not worry and that she would be free by the evening, after which she agreed with him. Rickard looked at the girl again, smiled at her, and reminded her that they would have to meet her at the appointed time. After this, the prince turned around and began to walk slowly towards the main building. Not far from him walked a sad girl, whose thoughts were now occupied with how to free herself from the difficult time that stood in her way after meeting this young man. Neither the prince nor his interlocutor noticed another person who was hiding in the rose bushes at that time and watching them talk among themselves. Fabian ran up to the prince and happily asked him if he had already spoken to the girl. Without even turning around or paying attention to the young man who had found him, the prince said just one word to him. Yes. Fabian suddenly became dumbfounded and stopped after the prince said that this girl was certainly fit to serve. He even asked again about her having to serve. The prince turned his head slightly towards him and said that he was talking about the child who had run after the young man. It was this girl who would have to serve him. Fabian stood there, completely confused. He couldn't understand how it was possible that his cousin would serve a young man, even though he was a prince. It looked completely inappropriate. Rickard turned to him again and asked the young man why he was standing there. At this point, Fabian scratched his head again, gasped, and told the prince that he had forgotten something while building, and would His Highness mind if he stepped away for a while. The prince replied that, of course, he would not object, and the young man was free to do whatever he wanted. His companion bowed to His Highness and said that in that case he would go. The prince continued his movement through a huge garden. He admired the view that opened up from here and thought that his stay in this place could be quite funny and interesting. The young man smiled slightly, thinking that despite all the preparations for his arrival, they had been fruitless. He decided that if the owners of the house were going to deceive him, they should have discussed everything among themselves first. Smiling slyly, the prince thought of Fabian, the heir of the family, who turned out to be less intelligent than the illegitimate daughter of the family, Charlotte. The young man remembered the girl's face again, and he noticed how her hands were shaking. He was satisfied that they had met, and he intended to take full advantage of it. The girl was also thinking about their unexpected meeting at that moment. She couldn't shake the thought that after her first meeting with the psychopath, she was still alive. At that moment, she heard her cousin approaching her from behind and calling her name. He gave her the diary he had taken earlier and asked the girl if she had spoken to the prince. In response, the girl only told him to follow her. And when they found themselves in one of the abandoned places of the extension, she asked her cousin why he brought her to him. Her cousin immediately cheered up. He smiled and said that there was no need for thanks. Well, he then added that it wasn't that he didn't want to, but he still decided to please his sister. Sabin immediately shouted loudly in his face, asking him if he was crazy, and added that how could he even think of doing something like that without warning anyone? Fabian replied to his cousin that, in his opinion, he did not have to warn anyone, and with his actions, he was simply fulfilling her wish, and therefore asked what the problem was. She asked him sharply when she had said something like that, and then suddenly stopped and fell silent, wondering if he had really come to such conclusions himself. She wondered if that time when she said that she was an illegitimate child who had no right to show herself in front of the crown prince, and that was why everyone was hiding her. Perhaps those words were the reason for her cousin's actions. Looking at the young man now, she wondered what it meant that this idiot had interpreted her words in this way, and she suddenly wondered when he had started worrying about her. The little Duchess simply did not have the strength to express all the feelings that were raging inside her now. So she burst into tears, not knowing what to do next. When she told her cousin that she had told the prince that she was the daughter of a maid, he said that it was her fault that the prince had misunderstood everything. Sabin told him that the prince had told her to help him while he was there. They had agreed to meet at the outbuilding after his classes, and her brother was to come there too. Fabian still couldn't understand what was going on. He said that it was his sister who lied, and how could he be a god here? To which the girl replied that he was also involved in this. When the young man declared that all this was nonsense and that his sister's lies would cause him a lot of trouble, the girl, as if nothing had happened, replied that he would be forced to agree with her because this was her grandfather's order. The young man was literally stunned by her words that it was the old duke who told her to introduce herself to the estate workers if she did run into the prince. He began to make excuses, stuttering, and said that he never knew that her grandfather treated her like that. The young Duchess replied that, be that as it may, it was Fabian who was to blame for this meeting with the prince, which should not have happened at all, and therefore now he must do what she says. Sabin thought that this young man, her cousin, had treated her like a servant before, and she could not understand why he was so sympathetic now. She told him that he must do everything she told him, and if he refused, she would have to tell Monsieur Simon that it was he who had forced her to meet the prince, and then asked him if he was afraid of being punished. Fabian was shocked how everything suddenly turned against him. He wanted to protect himself, and so he cried out loudly that he only wanted to help the girl, and then asked her if she thought anyone would believe her. Sabin then turned to him sternly and said that he should do what she said and stop stuttering. In the end, everything happened as she said. The young man realized that he had no choice but to agree with his and her words, and prepared to act. He also asked the girl to think one last time, because she could be arrested if something suddenly went wrong. But his cousin silently moved along the dark and dirty corridor of the annex, thinking that her brother wanted to say that if she deceived anyone from the royal family, she would be punished. In her opinion, he behaved like a real fool. After the chick's fencing lesson was over, the girl went to the appointed place in the garden, putting her hat on her head. When she arrived, she greeted His Highness. Rickard smiled when he saw her and said that he saw that they had come together with Mr. Fabian and said that they should have a fun time. After that, he turned his head towards the young man standing next to him and added that he had not expected at all that Fabian could be such a good assistant. When her cousin said that he was making sure that the prince was comfortable with his work here, the girl thought that this was a real disgrace and almost cursed. She looked at the prince and thought that he had come after all. It was her cousin's fault that she was in danger now. But now he had to serve as a living shield if the prince suddenly decided to attack her. She always thought her cousin was a real idiot. But besides, he was trained in family magic, so at the slightest danger to her, he could probably resist the prince. Fabian had joined them. Perhaps they should have a little archery competition. The girl smiled and said that in that case she would prepare everything now. Smiling, she thought that now the prince should not kill anyone, and everything should end well. They went out onto the lawn. 2 young men and a girl whom the prince addressed by the name of Vivian A. She seemed to have forgotten for a second that she had introduced herself to the prince by that very name, and therefore did not immediately answer his question. When targets were hung on 2 trees standing next to each other, the prince asked the girl who she was going to root for in their competition. Sabin wondered what the childish question was about. She didn't want to answer but to something like that, but she couldn't refuse. Smiling, she thought that perhaps this was just a test of loyalty. So she laughed loudly and said that she would of course root for the prince. After this, Rickard turned to her and asked why she decided so. The girl didn't know what to answer, so she decided to ask a counter question, saying the word, "What?" Standing nearby with a bow in his hand, the prince explained that he believed there must be some reason why she chose him. The girl smiled and began to think about why the prince was asking about this. She thought that, frankly speaking, even if Fabian were competing with someone else, she would definitely side with the opponent. When the prince asked her why she was silent and demanded that she tell everything as it was, the girl began to slowly choose the words for her answer. The prince seemed a little surprised by her words when she said that the prince was taller and more handsome than the young master. And besides, he was very cute. Noticing the expression on the young duke's face, the prince laughed loudly and said that, in his opinion, he should devote more time to his image. To which the young man replied that he was fine with it and that the girl was simply unable to comprehend his beauty. Rickard smirked as he looked at his opponent and asked him if he was offended that he had not been chosen in the end. Fabian began to justify himself and said that he was in no way offended and agreed that the girl had agreed to root for the prince. After this, the prince said that since the young lady had decided to support him, he could not lose face and quickly pulled the string of his bow to send the arrow to the target. The arrow quickly flew out of the bow and quickly approached the target, landing somewhere far from its center. The next arrow hit closer to the center, but it was still an inaccurate shot that could only be regretted. In the end, both boys took their shots at the targets, and it seemed that the winner could be easily determined, since their results varied significantly from each other. The prince said that, alas, it seemed he had missed too many shots, and added that Fabian was not at all bad at archery. His opponent laughed loudly, happy that he had won their competition, but he still decided to answer that this was not at all true, and the prince shot no worse than he did. The girl standing nearby wondered if her cousin was really serious about this, and even a fool could see that the prince was giving in. Rickard turned to the girl and said that she was rooting for him, but he unfortunately lost, and now it was unclear what they should do. The girl replied that it was just a training session. The prince replied that despite all this, he still felt awkward ending this training and small competition in this way. After these words, the young man grabbed another arrow, pulled the string of his bow, and asked his interlocutor to allow him to give her something as a keepsake. He began to take careful aim, placing the arrow to his eye, but at the same time he kept an eye on the little duchess standing next to him. She looked very scared because she didn't know what the prince could have chosen as his target. She hoped that this whole adventure would end well and no one would get hurt as a result. The arrow, shot from the prince's bow, whistled out and flew towards the target he had chosen. The next moment, high in the sky, the arrow hit the body of a poor, flapping white bird. The girl looked down at the ground, hoping that everything had happened without casualties and that she could be completely calm. At this time, the prince looked very thoughtful. It was unclear what this psychopath was thinking about, but it seemed to the girl that he could not have any thoughts in his head that were normal for a normal person. There was horror in her eyes. She thought it was all very scary. And although the prince had only shot a bird, she was so scared that she could not calm down and was still shaking with her whole body. It seemed that the prince did not care who felt what. He only cared about the target he had just hit. And so the young man said that the bird should not have fallen far from the place where they were now. Sabin said that since she was the prince's assistant, she would now go get the bird and bring it back. But Ricard looked strangely at the girl, who was hurrying as quickly as possible to get away from him somewhere, and said that she should not do this. He looked at the young man who turned around after his words and said that he would like Fabian to go there. When the girl's cousin asked if he should do it, the prince, as if nothing had happened, replied that he did not think it was worthwhile to send a small child into the forest alone, so it would be better if he did it. Fabian said why he considered the girl a small child, and added to His Highness that, judging by the girl's mental age, she must be about 30, but the prince would not tolerate any objections. He said that although their assistant seemed smart, it would still be difficult for her to walk such a distance. Fabian felt that his interlocutor was very angry with his reluctance to go into the forest after his words that the prince did not even realize how energetic this girl was. Sabin decided to intervene in their conversation, once again speaking about her desire to go into the forest for the killed bird. But the prince immediately interrupted her and again turned to Fabian, saying that it seemed to him that the young man was treating this young lady very disdainfully. Fabian was completely confused. He did not know what to answer the prince and began to talk about her. But then he stopped short and suddenly fell silent. The young man lowered his head, realizing that he could not tell His Highness that this little girl was not the daughter of the head maid, but was in fact his cousin and belonged to the Charlotte family. Ricard remained standing on the lawn, as well as a little girl who pretended to be the daughter of a simple servant. Her cousin was forced to go in search of the dead bird, saying that it would be better for him to go and find it himself. Sabin was terrified of being left alone with the psychopathic prince. She wanted to scream loudly that she didn't want to be here, but unfortunately she had to stand there, fearing for her life. Standing next to the smiling prince, the girl unsuccessfully looked for a way out of the situation. She did not know what to do. After all, she could not even imagine that she would be left alone with the prince. She couldn't help but think that she had tried so hard to avoid meeting the prince, but in the end, everything had turned against her, and now she was forced to stand next to this dangerous young man. Suddenly she thought, maybe she should go after Fabian. The girl turned sharply to the prince after he called her Vivian and asked him what he wanted. The prince said that perhaps their messenger would not be back for some time, and so perhaps they should rest a little until he returned. The weather was simply wonderful that day. There was hardly a single cloud in the sky, and what's more, the warm sun was shining brightly. The prince sat down on a blanket spread out on the grass of the lawn and invited the girl to sit down next to him. She immediately began to refuse his offer, saying that she did not dare to allow herself such impudence, and in her heart hoping that she would be able to refuse this mission that was unpleasant to her. Ricard smiled broadly at the girl and said that it looked completely inappropriate, and then asked her if she wanted to disobey his order. The girl understood that she would be forced to do this, because otherwise she could be accused of disobeying a person of royal blood. Therefore, despite everything, she decided that she would carry out the order. After that, she knelt down next to the psychopathic prince, who was comfortably seated next to him, still smiling and looking around. She felt very uncomfortable. She felt like she was sitting on pins and needles right now. And it was all because she knew what kind of person this young man really was. Without turning her head towards the prince, the girl thought that it would be great if Melissa were nearby now. But unfortunately, she was busy preparing treats at the request of her little mistress. The girl did not notice how the prince sitting next to her reached his hand towards the hat that was on her head. She only felt that the headdress had disappeared from her head somewhere, and, dumbfounded, she began to search for it with her hand on her head. Then she noticed it and turned to the prince, who was sitting next to her with his hat in his hand, saying that it was her hat. The prince said that the sun was blinding his eyes and asked if he could borrow it. Sabin was forced to agree with him. She was frightened by such impudence and unceremoniousness of the young man. As if nothing had happened, the prince lay down on the spread blanket and covered his head with the hat he had pulled off the head of his companion. The girl took this hat for a specific purpose. She did not want to show her hair once again, and so she decided to hide it behind the hat. The whole point was that the Charlotte family has a special feature, and it was this that the girl decided to hide with the help of a hat. All members of the Charlotte genus have bright, shiny hair, which makes them easy to distinguish from other people. Another distinctive feature of members of their family is the presence of bright blue eyes. Sabin thought that he had already managed to get a good look at her face, so there was no need to hide it. but if the prince focused his attention on these objects, he would immediately understand who she was. The girl really hoped that the prince would not suspect anything, at least as long as he lived in their mansion. It seemed to her that the young man lying next to him had dozed off. She felt light and free. Her soul suddenly became calm for some reason when a light breeze began to flutter her silky hair. She sat there, and suddenly a strange smell reached the prince's nostrils. He smelled the scent of peonies, which came from somewhere in the depths of the garden. Next to her, the prince continued to lie, covered with her hat and quietly snoring. When the prince told her about the smell of peonies, the girl replied that it was probably the smell of her hair soap, and she thought that the prince had a sense of smell like a dog. She suddenly remembered that, by the way, in the novel too, it seemed, there was a moment when Rickard caught the scent coming from the main character. The prince suddenly turned to her with a question. Since they were already waiting for Fabian, why shouldn't she tell at least a little about herself? Sabin thought for a moment and then replied that she had no interesting stories to tell. He continued to lie under his hat, and his voice came from under it. After which the prince replied that whether the story was interesting or not was for the listener to judge, not the storyteller. The girl continued to sit next to the lying prince and thought that it was hard enough for her to pretend to be Viviana. And what else could she possibly tell? That's probably why they say that a liar can't live happily, because he always makes up some non-existent stories. When the prince asked her how old she was immediately happy with the question because she knew the answer. The girl answered that she had recently turned 12. The prince responded with only an "ah," and the girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding what this exclamation could mean. Sabin was surprised by the words of her interlocutor, who said that in 12 years she should have accumulated at least a couple of stories, and then asked if it was difficult to be a friend of a young lady. The young duchess replied that it was not at all difficult since her mistress did not like her, so they were not particularly close to each other. After this, the young man, still hiding his head under his hat, asked why its owner did not like it. It seemed that this was also quite easy to explain. The girl said that her mother, the head maid, and the young mistress did not get along very well. When the prince asked her if there was anyone close to the duchess, the girl thought for a moment. She really didn't know what to answer to this question, because it seemed that in 3 years she hadn't made any special friends. Sabin began to wonder why the prince would decide to ask her a bunch of questions. She decided that in the end, this young man was trying to find out about her, thinking that she was just his girlfriend. Leaning against the blanket, she began to think about whether this was really so, or whether she was winding herself up out of fear of this prince, who might turn out to be a cruel psychopath. The girl replied that she did not think that her mistress could become close to anyone in this house. And when the prince asked if this was true, she explained that no one in this house valued the young mistress. The prince noticed that the situation of this little girl in this house seemed not so cloudless. Although at first it seemed to him that everyone in this house loved her, Sabin answered him that it did not seem like the girl had anyone she had a good relationship with. She said that no one loved her and asked if he had not heard the rumors. The girl could not understand where the prince could have heard that someone loved her. The girl realized that the prince was mistaken and told him that the young duchess was just an illegitimate child of the Charlotte house and that she was not at all welcome there. Clenching her hands into fists, the girl said that the prince still didn't know much, and what he would think if he knew how Mr. Simon treated his granddaughter, then he would not have said anything like that. The prince smiled slightly from under his hat and remarked that perhaps she did not understand the old man at all, and perhaps this was his way of showing his concern for the girl. She looked at the prince in bewilderment, thinking that he could hardly be right. After all, in 3 years she had never noticed a good attitude towards herself. She seemed to have lost control of herself. She would have liked to tell him everything she thought about her family, but she restrained herself as best she could, and only told him that such words hurt the young lady very much. After this, Rickard took off his hat, raised himself slightly, and declared that in that case it was very good that the young lady did not hear anything of their conversation. The girl listened to his words in silence, and the young man put the hat he had borrowed on her head again. After this, Rickard said that he would really like to advise this girl to look at the things around her from a different angle, because there is always a loophole that you don't immediately notice. The girl took in the information silently. She thought that the prince could not know anything about how hard her life was in this damned place. He, who lived all his time in the palace, did not know any hardships and was always treated with respect as the future heir. She still decided to ask the young man about something and asked that, based on his words, without tricks, the young lady would never be treated as a full-fledged member of the family. Looking at the prince, she thought that this young man could not know anything, since he was the one who was thrown out of the palace because of enmity with his own mother. And how could he advise her on how to act with her relatives? The prince did not take his eyes off his little interlocutor. At some point, he even began to feel sorry for her and thought that his life, compared to the existence of this child, was quite good, despite the fact that he was now expelled from his home. He told the girl that after all, it was okay to say that. You can't exist in this world without using some tricks. And if the circumstances demand it, sometimes you can lie. After this, the young man turned around and began to move towards the main building of the estate. Sabin stood behind him and did not know what to do. The boy was quickly moving away, and she did not dare to follow him. The girl tried to stop him by calling out loudly to the prince and telling him that Mr. Fabian had still not returned from the forest. After her words, Rickard stopped, turned around, and looking into her face, said that, in his opinion, it would be better not to bring him here in the future. The young man then smiled and told the girl that it seemed she actually hated her mistress's family, and asked her if he was right about that. Sabin was already tired of talking to this young man, although the conversations were still better than the supposed murders. But she was a little tired of all this. She thought that perhaps this conversation was important in some way. That day, if she realized anything today, it was that the prince looked more like a painting than a real person. The girl felt like he wasn't a real person. It was as if the young man was putting on a smile, and that's why it was deprived of any truthfulness and sincerity. She suddenly thought that his life was not very easy either, because what was it like to live without the ability to smile for real? It seemed that real human joys were not available to him, and he only played some kind of intricate role. Finally, it was all over, and she could go back to her now-loved annex. She felt a great relief that nothing bad had happened. She immediately told her maid that there would be no more treats. Sabin breathed a sigh of relief as she walked through the door of her room. She took off her hat and thought that now she could rest peacefully, without straining her nerves beyond all limits. But as soon as she stepped into her room, she immediately shuddered from the question that resounded in her, and the man who entered her room asked where she had been. This man was Mr. Simon, who had somehow entered her room while she was walking in the garden and was now sitting proudly in one of the old armchairs with which the outbuilding was filled. The old man's face looked angry and demanding. He was waiting for an answer to his question about where his granddaughter was at that time. He remembered that he had strictly forbidden her to appear in the yard so as not to meet their guest. The little duchess walked up to the chair where the man was sitting and greeted him. She said that she had gone out for a short walk in the yard because her room was very depressing. Looking at her grandfather's face, she was frightened, wondering if he could somehow know that the girl had met a prince in the garden. She was terrified even at the thought of disobeying this man. But then she thought that maybe it was all completely wrong, because if he knew something, he certainly wouldn't be sitting so calmly now. And so, the girl asked the Duke what brought him to this room. The Duke replied that he had merely decided to pay her a short visit. During their previous conversation, she had promised that she could make him tea if he came here. The girl thought that this would never happen. Last time she jokingly said that she would wait for him at the construction site, but she did not expect that her grandfather would agree to this, and especially that it would happen so soon. She paused at the door, wondering what to do now. She couldn't believe that the Duke would come here for such a trifle. Had he really come just for tea, which any servant in their palace could have prepared for him? Suddenly, she remembered the words of the prince, which he had said during the walk. She remembered well that perhaps in this way the old Duke showed his concern for her. The prince also advised her to look at the things around her from a different angle. What stuck in the girl's memory most were the prince's words about how there is always a loophole, and also that in order to survive, it is necessary to adapt to other people, and sometimes be cunning to do so. The girl suddenly thought that all this was true. Lately, when Mr. Simon looked at her, his gaze no longer reflected the former contempt for her, but felt some kind of melancholy. Perhaps it was because of the memories of his lost son. She suddenly thought that her appearance reminded her grandfather of her father, and therefore, looking at her, one could feel the father's longing for his beloved son. But what did it matter to her if she was still treated as an unnecessary thing? The girl decided that this was no excuse for the attitude she had always felt from her relative. He did not treat her the way she would have liked. She understood that their relationship was far from ideal, but she still wanted some kind of warm human relationship, and that's why she still hated this man. Sabin told the old man that he had come rather suddenly. She also told him that her maid was not there at the moment, so she would need more time to prepare everything. The girl thought that she should not show how much she hated this man. The girl folded her hands in front of her, holding her hat in her hands and hoping that the man would scold her for her lack of hospitality and then leave. But, to her regret, or on the contrary, to her satisfaction, this did not happen. It seems that the purpose of the Duke's visit was different, because in response to the girl's words, he offered to simply talk to her. She couldn't believe her ears and was stunned by her grandfather's offer. She would never have believed that he could come to her room, quite far from the main building, and go up to the 4th floor of the annex just to talk to her. She was forced to agree and therefore sat down opposite her grandfather, waiting to see what he would talk to her about. It seemed that the man was still hesitating whether he wanted to have this conversation, because there was complete silence and only their quiet breathing could be heard. Duke Simon nevertheless broke it and said that he still could not forget the tea that the girl had prepared for him last time. Sabin listened to him attentively, and then the old man asked her that she had probably heard about this drink from her father. The little duchess looked at her grandfather and thought that it turned out that he had come not out of interest in her, but only to learn more about her father. She thought that this was all his concern for her. If it had not been for the tea, she would never have waited for him to appear here. She looked into the Duke's face and said that it was not so. In the autumn, she learned from her father about the effect of this drink. The Duke thought for a moment and told his granddaughter that perhaps his question seemed rude to her. After this, the man began his story that when, in truth, her grandmother was still alive, then it seemed that this phrase was given to him with great difficulty, because his speech slowed down when the girl told him that it was his wife who brewed him chamomile tea with honey. Hearing this, the old man immediately said, "Didn't she say that your father didn't tell you anything?" The girl replied that yes, he really didn't tell her anything, and she simply followed the recipe he left. Hearing this, her grandfather suddenly jumped up from his chair, not understanding what she was talking about, and began to ask her what she was now trying to tell him. When the little duchess said that she had only read about this tea in her father's diary, the old duke, still standing by the chair, became excited and asked if they were really talking about Liam's diary. He immediately, with excitement in his voice and eyes, began to ask where this diary was now, and asked the girl if she had left it in her hometown. Then he added that her father treasured it very much. The girl confirmed his words that this diary was dear to her father, and therefore, after the funeral, she burned all his things so that they would also remain with him in the next world. Looking into the eyes of her grandfather standing in front of her, the girl decided that she had followed the prince in lying in order to manipulate people, and said that she really no longer had this diary. The girl knew that this was, of course, a lie, but she didn't want to say goodbye to something so dear to her, because she thought that as a result, the diary would be taken away from her. The old man looked disappointed. He simply said, "I understand." Sabin thought that she had found the diary and that now it belonged only to her. She did not want to share her father's memories with anyone. The old man seemed to have come to terms with the loss of his son's diary and asked the girl if she remembered what he had written. He added that perhaps she had at least some of it left in her memory. He clenched his hand into a fist, placed it on the arm of the chair, and said that perhaps she remembered something from the diary where he was mentioned. Sabin hastened to answer him that, unfortunately, she did not remember anything in the diary about the Charlotte family, except for the tea recipe. The old man seemed slightly relieved by this news. He said that it was very good. If this diary had fallen into the wrong hands, it might have brought shame upon the Charlotte family again. The girl looked at her grandfather and couldn't understand the expression on his face. There was no relief on his face, but rather it looked disappointed by the words she had just spoken. It seemed that the old man had still hoped to read something written by his dead son's hand. The girl looked at him and thought that all this was disgusting, because his father was forced to leave his home precisely because of this man, and in the end he died without ever waiting for forgiveness from him. After this, the young duchess looked at the door of the room and said that if she had answered all the Duke's questions, she thought it was time for him to return. She reminded him that it was almost time for the meal, and that he was probably expected in the main building. The old man said that he would probably go. She looked at the man's back as he walked away and thought that perhaps it had been a little cruel of her to treat him this way. Still, he might have earned the right to read his son's last notes. The girl was slightly taken aback by the man's words at the moment when he was about to leave her chambers, that he was sure she had already learned that the 5th prince had already arrived at their estate. Duke Simon turned around and told her that the prince visited the training ground every day, so she should try not to go outside, and if they suddenly met, she should definitely let him know. Sabin promised that she would definitely do it if it suddenly happened. Grandfather put his hand on the door handle and, as if apologizing to her, said that he knew that it was not a very pleasant place to be, but it was worth being patient for a little while. He added that he would definitely send someone to her soon to keep her company. He didn't have time to open the door because it suddenly opened in front of his nose, which, moreover, also really scared the old man, who didn't expect anyone to appear here. It was his grandson who burst into the room with a loud cry. Fabian screamed as soon as he stepped over the threshold of the room. Why did the girl leave without saying a word to him? But suddenly the young man stopped and, frightened, began to turn his head from side to side. He did not expect that his grandfather would be here. The man looked at him sternly and said that he would do well to mind his manners. Looking at the thing Fabian held in his hand, the Duke asked him what it was. The boy immediately began to stutter and search for an answer. He was thinking about how to fool the old man so that he would not find out the truth about his pranks. But then, seeing that there was hardly any plausible explanation, he showed his grandfather the bird he held in his hand and said that he had caught it for his cousin. The old Duke laid his hand approvingly on the young man's shoulder and said that, in that case, Fabian should come to the annex more often so that Sabin would not get bored. The girl looked at this scene and thought that the Duke did not think that he and Fabian had become so close. And here was another side of his indifference to his granddaughter. As soon as the grandfather left the room, Fabian immediately approached his cousin and began to question her. He was most interested in the question of what they were talking about. Sabin replied that it was nothing special, just some small trifles. After that, the boy asked why he came to her then. Then the girl decided to go on the attack against her cousin and asked why he came here, and added that perhaps he wanted to quarrel with her again. Fabian did not answer her question. He pulled out the dead bird in his hand and handed it to the girl. He said that he had come here only to give the prince's gift and told her to take it. The girl was shocked by the sight of the dead bird in her brother's hands, and he, as if nothing had happened, continued to talk about how he had spent so much time looking for her, and she had simply gone off to her room at that time, as if she couldn't wait for him a little while in the forest on the lawn. After hearing her cousin's angry tirade, the girl said that her brother seemed rather strange. When they were alone, he was constantly indignant, but for some reason he couldn't put two words together in front of the prince. The girl just fell silent when she heard her brother say that it was a strong word, and then he asked the girl what she really thought. Fabian reminded her that it was she who said that the prince was more handsome and had a better character. He asked her if she really thought so. The young man began to think out loud and said that, okay, maybe he didn't have the best character, but why could she say that he was inferior to the prince in beauty? The girl grabbed her head and thought what kind of nonsense her cousin was talking when he said that they needed to have an honest talk. And perhaps she said all this only because of the prince's position and in order to please him. She didn't know what she should do with it. She was thinking about the bird at that moment. Since it was a gift from the prince, she should probably save at least the feathers. But Fabian couldn't calm down. He kept bombarding her with questions and even asked if he really couldn't shoot a bow any better than Prince Ricardo. After this, the young man said that the prince was able to hit the bird only because it was already wounded and was flying slowly. The girl understood that this was not so, and the bird was not injured. But she still decided to remain silent so as not to provoke her brother even more, who still reminded her that he was talking to her and did not want to tolerate her silence. The girl had a thin note in her hands, which she was now studying. She noticed that S was quite hospitable. R did not notice anything. The adaptation was going more smoothly than expected. She held a bird in her hand, which turned out to be a dove. At that moment, she realized that this was not just a bird, but someone's carrier pigeon. Attached to one of the bird's legs was a note, which she was now studying. She remembered her uncle holding an envelope in his hand and telling his butler that it needed to be delivered to the palace. It was ordinary mail, delivered by messenger. She remembered that during dinner, Duke Benjamin had called his servant to him and ordered that this message be delivered to the Empress's palace as quickly as possible. She also remembered her uncle's words that, of all the methods, they demand that these letters be used, because the people in the palace are too conservative and do not want to use the achievements of science and progress. The old Duke agreed with his son and added that perhaps all this was due to the magical barrier. The girl remembered that she seemed to have heard something about this before. At that moment, the Duke was complaining about the method of communication with the palace. As it turned out, the palace was shrouded in ancient magic, and therefore handwritten messages could not get there. That is why pigeons have been chosen as the postal service. The messages they deliver remain the only way out of the current situation. It is possible that the dove that the prince shot with his bow today was sent by someone to deliver one of these messages. Sitting at her desk, the girl began to analyze the events and thought that this meant that it was written to someone from the imperial palace. But the question remained as to whom it could have been addressed. She looked again at the note lying on her desk and thought that perhaps this stood for Charlotte and there could only stand for Ricard. And thus, someone was reporting to the palace about the prince's current situation in the palace where he now found himself. The girl thought about it and began to think about who might need it, because this person continues to follow the fifth prince, although he was at that moment ousted from the race for the throne. She suddenly thought that this could be the man who had suffered so innocently at the hand of the prince and who still cared about his fate. Or perhaps it was the Empress Florencia who had driven her son out of the palace. Sabin began to think about the consequences if the letter was not received by the addressee. It seemed to her that the information in it was not important enough to somehow influence the course of events. She continued to look at the dead bird and the note she had found on it, and wondered if there was any need to tell the prince about all that had happened. She really didn't want to get involved. She remembered the words of the young man as he took aim for the last shot from his bow and said that he asked permission to give her something as a keepsake. The girl suddenly thought deeply and ordered herself to stop, as if she had discovered a missing detail in all her conclusions. She suddenly realized that perhaps the prince already knew he was being watched and had only gotten rid of the carrier pigeon. She decided that if he knew he was being watched and still gave her the carrier pigeon, looking at the dead bird, the girl began to think that perhaps this was just a test, and the prince would kill her if she could not pass this test. But then she decided that everything should be okay, since that was exactly why she was taking Fabian with her. But what worried her most was something completely different. Remembering the plot of the novel, she did not forget that in the original story, Ricard always hid his true magical power. It was not without reason. He kept everything secret and hid the power that was under the control of the young man until he went to the battlefield. The girl suddenly thought about what might happen if, instead of a sword, he used his ability to kill her. She was amazed that she had not foreseen this possibility before. This was a very important detail, and she needed to know about the abilities of the imperial family now, and she needed to do it immediately. The girl decided that there had to be some way to change everything. And although it was already deep night outside, she still continued to think about how to get out of this difficult situation. He suddenly realized that his time had finally come. The time when he could rule the world undividedly and use his enormous power, which had accumulated over many years, as he wished. At this time, the devil, who had continued to slumber in the depths of the earth for many years, revealed himself, and an incessant rain of fire fell from the sky, flooding everything around, and nothing living could withstand its onslaught. As soon as the earth became his fiefdom, the sleeping dead rose from their deep graves and stretched their old paws to the surface. The earth felt that it could no longer resist the onslaught of the dark forces. It could not bear fruit because it was infected with filth. It had no strength left to resist the onslaught of the sinister dark forces. People were scared and in horror could do nothing. All of humanity was plunged into chaos. Fires caused by the fiery rain blazed all around, and people had nowhere to hide from the resurrected dead. It was at this time, which was so favorable for him, that Lamarck Shazari gained his divine power, which was capable of everything on this previously peaceful planet. He understood that all the power of the universe was concentrated in his hands, and now he could fully rule over his subjects, who greeted him in horror and immediately bowed their knees before him. Thanks to his power, he was able to do a lot. It was he who managed to imprison evil in lands where the sun never shone. God, overjoyed by the victory, gave people magic. And this became the basis of a magical empire that lasted for 1,000 years and was still in full bloom. After the evil forces were defeated, the empire was settled, and nothing could threaten its prosperity and the happy life of its inhabitants. After reading all this in the book she found in the library, the girl closed it, put her hand on it, and thought that she had wasted her time on it, because she had not been able to obtain any valuable information. Sitting in her chair with a book on the history of the empire, Sabin thought that she already knew very well that the Cesare family was endowed with divine power, but unfortunately in the book she did not find any mention of what this power was. She thought about it and remembered that the novel her friend had written was also nothing but romance. How would she like to get at least a little detail about the royal family's magical powers now? The girl again remembered her writer friend, who always said that nothing could be more important than romance. The girl was distracted from her thoughts by the appearance in her room of Dr. Evgenia, who came to the scheduled lesson and greeted her student. The doctor brought a whole pile of thick books and, with surprise, told the girl that she seemed to be not wasting time and was busy reading. Looking at this nice woman who was always ready to help her, the girl suddenly thought that it was definitely Dr. Eugenia who could help her, because she should know something about it. Smiling happily, Sabin immediately jumped up from her chair and, turning to the teacher, asked if she knew the history of the Empire well. The doctor finally got rid of her heavy burden, putting the books on the nightstand, and said that, of course, she had studied history, and asked the girl if she was really interested in it, and then asked if she shouldn't have studied it at the beginning of her studies. The girl had to justify herself. She lowered her eyes and said that she needed it for business. Anyway, the prince had been living here for some time, and she would like to know a little more about his family. She explained that the appearance of the young man had aroused her interest in the imperial family, and now she would like to know more about its history. But unfortunately, she had no one to ask in the mansion. The doctor immediately clasped her hands over her mouth. She was amazed at how lonely this girl felt. It must be so hard for her, since she couldn't even turn to anyone with a question, except for her mentor. The woman immediately bowed before her little student and took her palms in her own. She told the young duchess that she had absolutely no reason to worry and promised to tell her everything at once. The girl smiled happily. She had not expected that doctor. Eugenia would immediately be moved by her request, and she thought that her teacher seemed to be very sentimental. After the girl said that she had heard that members of the imperial family could control space, her teacher sat down next to her and replied that all of this was true, and that it might even seem like this ability was limited to moving people and objects, but in fact, this ability contained unlimited power. Dr. Eugenia raised her hand up and pointed her finger, saying that the royals could even create space or seal someone, and that might not be all the skills they could use. The little student asked her that then they could probably move directly to some person and kill him. Right now, the girl was most interested in this question. After all, her future fate and life depended on the answer to it. She would like to be ready for any circumstances. Dr. Eugenia smiled and said that this was, of course, possible, but for members of the royal family, there were easier ways. She said that any of their kind could simply move the sword to where the heart was, or even do it in an even simpler way. For people with such enormous magical powers, it would be quite easy to rip out their enemy's heart from a distance. And besides, the doctor said that, in her opinion, they have many other ways to kill a person. These words of the teacher literally stunned her little pupil. She suddenly realized that with all the variety of methods that the prince and his family members could use, she had no chance of avoiding death. She was still able, trembling with the horror that filled her body, to ask the teacher if this meant that they were practically invulnerable. Dr. Eugenia replied that, of course, one could say so, because the rule of the Cesare family continues to this day, and for many years of rule, nothing and no one has threatened their power in this empire. When the teacher looked at her little student, she noticed that her body suddenly began to tremble violently. She could not understand what had happened to the girl. The woman immediately rushed to her with the intention of helping her and thought that perhaps she had given too cruel examples in her story. In order to somehow calm the little duchess, the doctor smiled and told her that abilities had not been manifested in the imperial family for a long time, and no one could now convincingly claim that they still possessed them. The doctor approached the girl and began to explain to her that there was no need to be afraid of the stories of the past. In this era in which they now lived, virtue was valued much more than strong abilities. But her student was completely absorbed in her thoughts. The girl thought that the doctor did not understand anything, and that was why he spoke like that. She remembered the plot of the novel again, and in the original, it was Rickard who received divine power and was able to use it successfully. And now she thought that if the prince used this power, he could easily kill her, and she would not be able to stop him in any way. Sabin was ready to cry from the despair that filled her soul. She did not know what to do, and now she realized that the more she learned about the prince, the more helpless she felt. Dr. Eugenia leaned over her student and looked into her face, but the girl was silent and at that time was thinking only about whether she could survive. To bring the girl out of her thoughts, the doctor was forced to wave her hand in front of her face and address the young lady. She asked the girl if she was all right and noticed that she seemed to have an unhealthy complexion. The Duchess quickly replied that she was fine, but was just a little surprised that the imperial family was so powerful. At this moment, there was a knock at the door of the room. Then Melissa opened it slightly and, turning to her mistress, asked if she could spare her a minute. When the girl came out of the room and asked her what was the matter, Melissa began to look around and thought about how to tell her mistress what, in her opinion, no one should hear. The girl covered her mouth with her hand and began to whisper that she had recently met His Highness the Prince, and, what was strangest, he was looking for some daughter of the headmaid, and so she asked the lady that it was probably her. The girl was simply dumbfounded when she heard about this. She did not want to meet the prince at all. especially after she learned how much power his family members could have. Now it seemed that her death was inevitable. She turned to the maid and asked her to inform Dr. Eugenia that she had urgent business. On the way outside to the place where they had agreed with the prince, the girl wondered if the prince had already finished training. She hoped that she would have a little more time to prepare for the meeting with him. As soon as she appeared on the lawn, the young man turned towards her, greeted her, and said that he was glad to see her. The girl also greeted His Highness, but there was no joy in her eyes, no smile on her face. She was burdened by the meeting with this dangerous man. Suddenly, the girl became silent and dumbfounded. After raising her head, she noticed that this should not be here, and everything should have happened completely differently. She was terribly scared and hoped that her death would not happen today, and she would be able to prepare for it properly.